As those who hang out in Chabad shuls know, one of the papers, the Kaiftzim Gulyonis that are put out in the shuls every week, is the weekly Kaivitz by Lahak. They're going through the Rebbe's Farbrengens, from Sichas Kodesh in Yiddish, and other sources, and they're rewriting it in Hebrew. Later gets published in the volumes of Teres Menachem. But as a bonus to every Kaivitz, they also look for letters of the Rebbe that haven't been printed yet, or haven't been printed in a chashuva source, as opposed to perhaps a torah, and it's haste that they're collecting the letters from Miluim to Igros Kodesh. So if you're picking up the Kaivitz and you're looking for something interesting, the chances are maybe 50-50 that you'll find something interesting in the Farbrengen versus that you'll find something interesting perhaps in the letters in the back. So the following is based on and inspired by the letter that appeared in the back of last week's Kaivitz for Parshas Eikev. And originally in my mind it was a small thing. I was even thinking maybe I'm going to combine it with a few other small things. We'll try out a new segment, a new feature, a new topic, concept, odds and ends. We'll string a few small interesting things together. But as I was rounding up all the information to put this together, it's pretty clear to me already that this is going to be pretty much the same usual length as many other topics we've done. But at least in my mind, I've maintained my original gedank, my original machshava, that it's a smaller thing, it's not a davar hashalim. So in certain parts, I cut myself some slack. I told myself, hey, you don't have to quote every single mucker, every single source. You can take it easy. So I hope you'll cut me some slack as well. But anyway, let's jump into it. So last week's Kaivitz, like I said, the Kaivitz of Lahak, the Kuntras of Lahak for Eikev. So they printed a Sicha from Farbrengen from Tafshin Lamed Vav, but in the back, they printed a letter from the Rebbe, Dafka from the early years, from Tafshin Vav, from 1946. And interestingly, it's a letter, Miksav Kodesh. So a full 2 pages of the Rebbe's Ksav Yad, entire letter, the entire draft was written Miksav Kodesh. And they wrote there that portion of this letter is already printed, Bim Kaimoy, in Igros Kodesh Chelik Beis, Igeres Reshut Beis, 212, and as well in the Isafis to look at the Sikha somewhere. But here, we're getting the full letter. There it was just partial. Here we're getting the full letter, Al Pi, the image of the Ksav Kodesh. And they don't fully touch it, but if you go look it up, you'll see that in Igros Kodesh and elsewhere, they only printed the beginning of the letter and the end of the letter, which is more teichendik. And the middle of the letter, which the Rebbe was writing about inyanim relating to printing, because the Rebbe was writing the letter, the premise of the letter was really about establishing a branch of Kahas, Chabad's publishing house in Shanghai, and what they're going to print in Shanghai, and talk all this harm that were printed there. So that was the premise, that's the middle of the letter. So in Igros, they only printed the beginning and the end, that's more teichendik, and they omitted the middle. And here, we have Ksav Yad Kodesh, and we're going to print the entire thing, we're going to type up the entire thing. So they print both the typed up letter and the images of the Ksav Yad Kodesh itself. Now, because they reprinted the whole thing, so Dafka, part of the teichendik part of the letter, caught my eye, and even though that's the part that was printed already, that's not the Chiddush, that's not the Pirush HaMinushin, but because it caught my eye, that's what I want to focus on here. And in my opinion, though, there's a very important passage here, the teichendik part that was printed, because the Welt needs the teichendik part, and yet I think there's something very important here that's been mostly overlooked, that it's very important to call attention to, which is why I am going to focus on it. So let's get to the letter. The letter begins, Beis Hey, Yud Beis Adarish, and Tafshin Vav. And it's written Rashi Tevis, but Rashi Tevis should be understood b'lashon Rabbim, l'harabanim ha'goinim, v'harabanim ha'chasidim, etc., like sort of the standard l'shainas. But then there are these extra special l'shainas, Hölchi goyla achar goyla, loksa b'keflayim, yizku l'geula achar geula, nacham b'keflayim, hatmimim b'chol nilvam alei moshiach. So the Rebbe is sort of reaching out, making contact with entire goylas, timchitmimim, or stuck in Shanghai, with special l'shainas, and there are asterisks on the l'shainas, makar and chassidus for these concepts. Goyla, geula, we're not getting into that. The Rebbe says, got your letter from the beginning of Shvat, Toida l'kel asher hechiyanu b'kiyimanu kulanu be'eis hanei ro'a Asher Avra Al Kaf Beis Yud, presumably Kol Bnei Yisrael. So interesting L'shain is how the Rebbe is sort of exhaling at the end of the Holocaust, and the Rebbe is acknowledging what just happened, because we know from the Rebbe Bechlal, as the years went on, the Rebbe didn't really refer to the Holocaust too much, acknowledge it too much. That's its own topic. So for that reason alone, it's interesting to see the Rebbe reaching out to a post-Holocaust community and fully acknowledging and embracing and saying, Shechion v'kiyimanu, after this terrible kufa, this terrible ace that we all experienced. And here comes what to me is a key passage. And in parentheses, the Rebbe writes, Lahor mimasha kasav b'kuntris sfas emes seif lamed hey shebesoif sefer emes liyaakov shekoydem bias moshiach tzarech lias or tzrich lias hanesira hakelelas vav alfen shnin v'zeu inyan chevlei moshiach v'chulu. So it was mitzayin to some kind of mocker that mentioned some kind of kabbalistic concept, and that's inyan of chevlei moshiach, which the Rebbe is clearly tying into this theme in the introduction of what we just experienced, the Holocaust. But I noticed, interesting marmok in Kuntras Svas Emes, people know the name Svas Emes, that's clearly not what the Rebbe is being mitzayin to here. Kuntras Svas Emes, Shebesef Sefer Emes Liyaakov. So immediately I looked in the footnotes to see Bush Dart and what did they say about this marker, this marmokim. Zero, no acknowledgement. Is Ishtozach and other marmokimis and talk about those. Nothing here about this marmokim. It's not a marmokim that I know. I don't think it's a marmokim that the average person would know. It also doesn't sound like it's a particularly old sefer. If it was from 500 years ago, even if it wasn't so bavos, maybe there would be an Indian to know what it is, but it doesn't even sound like it's that old. What's the sefer? Interestingly, when you turn the page and you look at the Tzilum Ksaviat Kodesh, you could see very clearly that this paragraph, Lahoyer, etc., was added after the Rebbe had continued writing the following paragraphs. Meaning the Rebbe went back and added this paragraph, this line, in very small. You had to squeeze it in between two paragraphs in the small space. Squeezed it in, smaller letters. Looks like a different, maybe a pen instead of a pencil. Totally different color. Although interestingly, at the end of the letter, as we'll see, the Rebbe gets back around to this point about the Nesira. So Muzman Zagen, that the final paragraphs of the letter, even though they look like they're written in the same pencil, must have been written after the Rebbe had added that paragraph at the beginning, perhaps in pen. So towards the end, the Rebbe, after the whole middle, which was previously omitted and has now been printed, so towards the end which was printed before, the Rebbe wrote, V'asayim inyan hapsicha be'inyan hanasira, to circle back to the topic of Nasira, as we'll get to. So like I said, the Rebbe mentions it here, the Rebbe comes back to it later. What does this say for? Who's the Sfas Emes, Kuntres Sfas Emes, and the Sefer Emes Liyaakov? What does it actually say there? Because the Rebbe is just quoting a few words. Stam is seeing the full context would be helpful. Who is this? What do they say? Why is there no ha'ara here addressing these questions? These are questions that I would have. And Bechlal, as we'll see, I've already picked up on this theme that the Rebbe is mitzayin to a range of svarim, a range of makayros, that the Rebbe clearly took a consistent interest in, and yet those who are Isaac in the Rebbe's Torah, Roiv, and those who are kaviyachol in charge of publicizing it, seem to take an active disinterest in recognizing, appreciating, looking up, being mitzayin to, etc., these types of makayros that the Rebbe was looking at and the Rebbe was using. And in my opinion, it's a bit of an avla to themselves and a bit of an avla to the tzibur that this is being overlooked and neglected. And this was my thought going into it, noticing it. I'm already on the lookout for these types of Mara Mekaymis. I flagged them. And once again, I was not disappointed to having looked into it. As we'll see, this is in fact quite a fascinating Mara Makim that has many interesting ramifications for many things that the Rebbe discussed over the years. Okay, so who is Taka the Mechaber of Kuntres Sfas Emes in the Sefer Emes Liyaakov? So the answer is, the author is Rabbi Yaakov She'altiel Niño. Niño is a Sephardic name, Spanish name. And in fact, it's literally a word in Spanish. The way you would spell it in English is Nino, but the second N would have that tilde over it, that little swirl that tells you that it's pronounced Nye. So Niño is how you would pronounce it. If you follow the weather, the news relating to the weather, so there's something in the tchum of weather that's known as the El Niño. That's the term that's used for it. We're not getting into that, of course, but just the word. It's cute to come across these names, these Sephardic names. I find it interesting to decipher them. There is a Hebrew Wikipedia article for Rabbi Yaakov She'altiel Niño. So right off the bat, it's important to emphasize we're not talking about someone 500 years ago, but rather the range of his life is given as the year 1800 to the year 1849. So roughly around the tkufa of the Tzemach Tzedek. And he was born in Yerushalayim to Rav Yehuda and Luna Niño. So from the Sephardic mishpachas that lived in the Middle East, probably more or less since Gerish Sfarad. Learned in the Yeshivas Mekubalim, Beisel in Yerushalayim. It's the whole world, the whole universe of the Yeshivas Mekubalim, who's Rebbe. We're going to try to be Mekatzer, but he was one of the notable Mekubalim of his time, and he had connections with some of the other Sephardic Gedolim that time, that region. Another article that you can find about him that's a little bit more interesting and engaging is this website called Hachacham Hayomi, a website that's dedicated to highlighting Sephardic Chachamim. Perhaps they do it because to the yard site. I don't keep up with the website sort of on a daily basis to see what their seder is, but the links come up in searches, etc. So they also write roughly the same biography. He was born in 1800s to Chacham Yehuda and Nuna. He was named after his Zayda, who was Chacham Yaakov Niño. And so I want to point out that She'altiel seems to be part of his first name, meaning there is a family named She'altiel. So my Havamin was maybe his name was Yaakov, and then She'altiel Niño, hyphenated two last names. But no, it seems like everyone in the family is known as Niño, and his first name is Yaakov She'altiel, and this is already at a point when it seems to become very prevalent for Sephardim to have more than one name as well. So Yaakov She'altiel, named after his grandfather Yaakov Chacham Yaakov Niño from Tzfas. So originally Yerushalayim, Yeshivas of Golem Beisel, but then it wasn't easy to live there. He moved to Tveria. There was a Sephardic community in Tveria. And Tavkuf Tzaddik Gimel, 1833, he was sent on shlichus to Izmir. He met Reb Chaim Palachi, returned to Tveria. In Tavkuf Tzaddik Daled, 1834, there was a rebellion, and that ended up leading to a pogrom, an attack by the local Arabs against the Yidden in Tzfas. And Yaakov She'altiel Niño describes how he had a nes that really he was in Tzfas around that time because he had been in Tzfas from Lag BaOmer till Shavuos, and he was planning to stay there for Shavuos. But he had a dream that he should leave and return home before Shavuos, and that's why he was saved from the pogrom, which took place Isru Chag Shavuos. So that was one nes. Another nes that happened to him was that in Tavkuf Tzaddik Zayin, 1837, you had the famous earthquake, Tzfas, Tveria, and the story is that he was in the Beis Medrash in Tveria during the Rash, and he had bent down to say Kriya Shema. When he opened his eyes, the whole shul was gone. He sees he's under the sky. There's no more ceiling. The walls had collapsed. There's 50 Harugim, Rahman al-Itzlan, around him. He's the only one who remained alive. So that was another nes, but it was a huge disaster, and they had to go to Chutz La'aretz to fundraise for the Yidden in Tveria. And he returned to Tveria in 1846, and he passed away around 3 years later, 1849, although we don't know exactly when he passed away. But the ikar is, as they write, both in Wikipedia, Chacham Hayomi, he wrote two svarim. One is Emes Liyaakov, and that's the Emes Liyaakov that we are concerned with here, which is like a mafteach to Torah HaKabbalah, which he printed himself in the year Tafresh Gimel, 1843. So, B'chai at Tzemach Tzedek, middle of the Nesius of the Tzemach Tzedek, just to place it on the timeline. So, he's one of these Mekubalim, the Yeshivas HaMekubalim that were printing Sfarim and Kabbalah. And as they write, the second half of Emes Liyaakov is a Kuntres Sfas Emes, which is Shalos HaTshuvas Binyane Teres HaSoid. Additionally, he also has a Sefer Zeri Yaakov of Drushim, different style. unique, original drushim, blending halacha, Kabbalah. It was printed by his son, Chacham Meir Niño, in 1912. And that's pretty much where that ends. We'll get back to these Sfarim in a bit. So, first of all, before we even continue, like I said, I already have my antennas up to see what interesting Sfarim the Rebbe is being assigned to, Dafka Sfarim that don't get attention. So what do we have here? The Rebbe is being mitzayin, once again, because this is not the only time, to a Sefer in Kabbalah that's fairly late from the circles of the Yeshivas and Kabbalah in Eretz Yisrael throughout the last few hundred years, in this case from the 1800s, like we said, Chai Tzemach Tzedek, and this is something that's a pattern with the Rebbe, and I've pointed this out a number of times. I don't know if it's been in the recordings or not, but in my notes to myself, this is a very strong pattern with the Rebbe. The Rebbe took a very strong interest in this genre of writing. We see it, one place I've pointed out many times is that there's a letter from the Rebbe. It's not in Igris, but it's been printed elsewhere, where the Rebbe wrote Shimas Hasfarim, something like that. The Rebbe wrote to someone in Eretz Yisrael, here's a list of Sfarim that I'm interested in. It was in the context of a certain Moicher Sfarim and maybe their catalog, but the Rebbe said, here are the ones that interest me, and it's a long list, a long list. It has 10, 20 Sfarim on it, but the first few and the notable ones on it are all Kabbalah Sfarim from the last 200-300 years, from the Kabbalah and the Yeshivas and the Kabbalah. So you see the Rebbe taking an interest there. Not only that, in the last few years, they took high-quality photos of all the Sfarim in the Rebbe's room, the Rebbe's personal library, and there's a shelf there of Kabbalah Sfarim, and you can see some of the Kabbalah Sfarim that correspond to that list. So you see the Rebbe Taka obtained them, and the Rebbe had a shelf. This is a shelf in the Rebbe's library of these types of Sfarim. But it's not just from these Makaitis, but once you know that the Rebbe has an interest in these Sfarim, and you start looking through Igris, etc., you'll notice that the Rebbe actually makes use of these Sfarim, both in Yanim relating to Nusach HaSiddur, Minhagim relating to that, because they were interested in the world of Kavanas, and the world of Kavanas in the Yeshivas and B'Kabbalim actually corresponds very strongly to questions of Nusach in our Siddur. So in that context, and other Kabbalah-influenced topics in Halacha, getting stuck at night, questions like that. But even sometimes in Yonei Kabbalah, more pure Yonei Kabbalah as well, the Rebbe does make some use of these Sfarim, and this to me is an important yisoid. If you want to understand the Rebbe, you want to understand what the Rebbe is looking at, like I've said before, you want to be looking at what the Rebbe is looking at, and you want to know how to actually approach these topics as a serious scholar. You actually want to study in Yonei Halacha al Pi Kabbalah, in Yonei Nusach al Pi Kabbalah, or even in Yonei the Kabbalah Shebechsidus. So it seems pretty clear that a serious scholar should take an interest in all these Sfarim and be looking at all these Sfarim, which is what the Rebbe did. So that's why it's a constant with me to look out for this. And yet again, this is clearly what is happening in this instance as well. And yet, for some reason, it doesn't seem like many other people are party to this havchana, and it often seems like everyone else is pretty much trying to ignore it as much as possible. So I don't understand how it's possible to follow in the Rebbe's path and understand the things that the Rebbe's reading the ayin and the Rebbe's writing about if you're refusing to look at the sources and the resources that the Rebbe was using. Elamai, there is a strong, prevalent streak of we only look at our Sfarim, we don't look at other people's Sfarim, especially from the last few hundred years, once you have the Nesiach Chabad, the Rebbe's in Chabad, so surely that has everything we would ever need. You don't need other Sfarim. But we see clearly that the Rebbe doesn't think so. This is the Rebbe's pattern here in this regard clearly demonstrates that this is not accurate. And it's not just the Rebbe, but if you actually start paying attention, you'll see that it's really many of the Rebbeim. You could see this definitely with the Tzemach Tzedek and the Sfarim that he was quoting and using in his Rishimis, and with the Rebbe Rashab as well. The Rebbe Rashab certainly kept up with the Kabbalah Sfarim that were being printed and used them to some extent, even the Rebbe Marash a little bit. And then, of course, the Rebbe, as we're saying, the Rebbe to perhaps even a greater degree, and including Sfarim that were printed in the 150 years prior to the Rebbe. And in addition to just the technicality, that I can prove that the Rebbeim hold otherwise, but it's like I always say, Context is part of Havana. You want to have proper Havana, you want to understand something, you need to have context. And context could be many things. It could be understanding the Metzias, it could be understanding the background, it could be understanding the intellectual history of how an idea developed in the swarm that it went through. And it seems pretty clear that the Torah of the Chachmei Yeshivas HaMekubalim also serves as a sort of general context to inyanim, to sugyas that are known in Chabad. And in Chabad often there's just like a very limited vart, a very limited nekuda raid, and yonei halacha, and yonei hanhaga. And if you want to understand it properly, you need context. What's the context? Where's the context? Looking at what the Chachmei Yeshivas HaMekubalim are writing, that is the context for many topics that in Chabad just exist as a nekuda without the larger context. So this is a personal, you can call it a pet peeve, you can call it whatever you want, but this will serve as another demonstration of this point. So what does it actually say in this makar that the Rebbe is mitzayin to? And what is the kuntres sfas emes? So I went to look it up. So I found that Yitzhak Chachma has the print that he printed, that the Mechaber printed, but there's also a new Mahadura, there's a Mochain Siach Shmuel that reprinted it around Tafshin Ayin, 500 pages plus Mafteches. And Kuntres Sfas Emes Taka appears there in this new edition from page 377 onward. And the Mechaber, Rabbi Yaakov She'altiel Niño, so he writes in his short Akdama, Amar HaKaisev, I sought to be Mechaber to connect this nice Kuntres Sfas Emes to the previous main bulk of the Sefer Emes Yaakov. And Sfas Emes contains 68 Shailas Atshuvas Upirushim Keminyan Chayim. What's his Shailas Atshuvas? No, Shailas Atshuvas, it's a question and answer format relating to Kavanas Hatvilas of Choel, Shabbases, Yom Tovim, Yom Neroim, because in the Yeshivas HaMekubalim, which is Messiachas, as he writes himself, to the Sar Shalom of Shalom Sharabi, we know was Oila from Yemen, and there already was a Yeshivas HaMekubalim, but he rose to lead it. He's known as the Rashash in the Kabbalistic context. So they have a whole kav, a whole mahalach of being mechav in the kavanas Arizal. That to them is still sort of the ikr, the yisoid, the central part of the avoida of a mekubal who's seeking to follow the derech of the Arizal. That's their conception, their self-conception. So they're focusing on the kavanas. However, in the inyan of kavanas, there are many questions, many sfekas, large and small. And as I alluded to earlier, even though in Chabad, kavanas outright has pretty much vanished, although that is really its own topic, and maybe you've touched on it before, but it really is still lurking in the background, because like I alluded to earlier, the nusach hasidr, we daven from a sidr that's al pi nusach harizal. The nusach harizal is determined based on the kavanas harizal. So knowing the kavanas harizal is necessary in order to understand the nusach sidr ha'ari Shenischaber that was put together by the Alter Rebbe. So many of the sugyas in Kavanas among the Mekubalim correspond to questions of Nusach in Chabad. So, but he's focusing Taka directly on the question of Kavanas, Lefi, the Kav of the Rashash in the Yeshivas Mekubalim. He writes that it's not Eigne Chadoshim, Ruben Kekulam is Kisvei HaKodesh of the previous Mekubalim. He calls them the Rabbani Go'eni Chasidi Elyon. And of course, I'll write Shmam HaToiv Dover B'Shem Oimrei, and a small amount is Taka original for me that I was Machadash. And then after that, so that's Sfas Emes, 68 such questions and answers. And at the end, I also pasted 10 Tikkunim, Tikkuni HaNefesh, Tikkuni HaGuf, Lefi, this world of the Arizal and the HaHolchem Be'Kvoisov. And he says, why did he call it Sfas Emes? Sfas v'shetevis she'elus perushim tikunim. He also has there's a gematria. Sfas is begematria, my name, She'altiel, plus the 7 oisius. So again, you see She'altiel is his personal name. And he ends off, sure, the Schos Rabban Makdaishim, whose Torah I'm publishing, will protect me and they'll daven for me, etc. So, like he said, the Rum Kekulim is Kisvei HaKodesh, and Taka from Ois Dalid and onward, out of the 68, he writes, Mikan ba'elach heim k'tzas shut v'hakdamas nechoinus l'inyan kavanas hatfilis mikuntres zimras ha'oret ksav yad. So, there are based on quoting from a pre-existing chibur called Zimras Arts, which was unpublished. So he's copying and pasting from there into here and publishing these passages for the first time. But technically, it's not him. Like he said, he's quoting others. Who's the Zimras Arts? The Zimras Arts is a makubal by the name of Rav Arizal, who's described as a Talmud Chaver of the Rashash. And the chibur, as he wrote, the Zimras Arts, was printed later in the year Tafresh Tzadik Beis, 1932. And I saw that there's even a new edition of it now. Today, there's a big renaissance printing all these Sifrei Kabbalah from all the Doidas, including from the Shivas Mekabalim. So there is a new edition of the Zimras Arts as well. And they write on the Sharablat that it also has Hagoyes from Rabbi Yaakov She'altiel Niño. I don't know if it's from the Sfas Emes here or from elsewhere as well. However, this new edition is not in the Yitzhar Chachma, but the old edition is. So this is all by way of background to understand what the Rebbe is quoting, because we want to talk, understand, and appreciate who and what the Rebbe is quoting. So Seif Lamed Hey, which the Rebbe is mitzayin to, is still part of this section that he copied from the Zimras Arts. So as we'll start, it will be the Zimras Arts, but there's also a Haggah, there are Haggahs from Yaakov She'altiel Niño. So, like we said, it's all about kavanas. So this is how Seif Lamed Hey begins. Chiluk Hanesiris. We're going to make a seder. There's a musik in Kabbalah, used in Chassidus as well. There's a concept of Nesira. So, like I mentioned at the beginning, in my mind, I don't want to pressure myself to make it a completely pure Davar Shalom. So, for example, I was not going to get into what the Inyan of Nesira is, V'taichma Nesira, but there's this concept in Kabbalah and Chassidus that you have these Dmuyos, tzuros, I don't know if that's the appropriate word to use, but at least in Kabbalistic lingo, that seems like you could use that term, in Atzilos, and they're supposed to be panim b'panim. However, they start off acher ba'acher, and there's an asira that's sort of sawing them. It's like almost like an operation to sort of saw them at where they're joined acher ba'acher, so that way they can now turn and face each other panim b'panim. I think that would be the very basic technical way of describing it. And this concept of Nesira, in Chabad in particular, for example, you'd probably hear it mostly in the context of Rosh Hashanah. Rosh Hashanah, there's the Inyan of Nesira. But really, the concept of the Nesira comes up in different contexts. So this ois in the Kuntres Sfas Emes, which is really copied from the Sefer Zimras Arts, is here to tell you Chiluk HaNesira. There's levels. So there's an asira that happens every day, ba'amida. And he uses some technical Kabbalistic terminology, Yaakov Rachel, etc. But it's on a smaller scale, as he'll keep on saying. There's each successive Nasira is on a larger scale. So in Kabbalistic terms, you can describe what the scope of the Nasira is. So this is a smaller scope, a smaller Nasira. So this Nasira every day is in the Amida, but every Nasir is a little scary, as we'll see. It's not a Pashat Azach. So the Nasir of every day requires Mesiras Nafshenu B'Tevas Ba'ava. When you come to the word Ba'ava, you have to have Mesiras Nefesh. Now, Ba'emes Echaltnish in the sugya of this kavana, what the story of this kavana is. You say Ba'ava, I think of the Berchas Kriya Shema, but he says he's talking about the Amida, so maybe he means Taka the Ba'ava in Shemona Esrei. Interestingly, we'll see that he has a vart later on this word ba'ava in Shemona Esrei, which maybe Taka is connected to what he's saying here, that you need Mesiras Nefesh by the word ba'ava connected to the stakes, the high stakes of this small Nasira. So that's Nasira number one. Then he says you have the Laila. And that, by Laila, there's a Nasira that's like of the Chav Dalet Shoyes. So it's like on a scale of the whole 24-hour cycle, and in Kabbalistic terms, it's affecting whatever the Chav Dalet Shoyes are Lamaila. So it's a larger Nasira, so there are more dinim, and it's Laila, and Laila is the time of din. So that's why night is a bit of a scary time, or a scarier time, because you have Nasira on a larger scale, and it's happening by Laila. That's the second Nasira. Then there's Rosh Hashanah. Rosh Hashanah is Nasira HaKeleles Shel Kol Hashana. So it's on an even larger scale. It's Nasira affecting the whole year, and perhaps also in Kabbalistic terms, it's whatever that would be. Hashana L'mayla. V'hu Yoser Kasha. It's even more Shver. Uzman Hadin. Shaboy nidoinim hamesim v'achayim. So v'tzarech tkiyah shofar v'esayris gadol. So the whole Rosh Hashanah, the reason why we take Rosh Hashanah so seriously, so in Kabbalistic terms, it's because of this big Nesira. And this talk corresponds pretty nicely to Chabad. We know that by the Rebbe, Rosh Hashanah Tkiyah Shofar is, I've said before, it's almost like the one time of the year that the Rebbe praves an Inyan, like tzaddikim, like mekubalim. We find that by other Chassidish tzaddikim, they prave a lot of mitzvahs, the esrig and the Chanukah lecht and other inyanim, and it's a whole zach, and it certainly seems downstream from the idea of mekubalim being mechav and kavanas. Go to other tzaddikim by the nanuim. The nanuim takes 5 minutes, 10 minutes, 20 minutes or more, and at least kaviyachol b'yusayda, it's mechav and the kavanas of the nanuim. So every mitzvah has big spiritual stakes. For whatever reason, in Chabad, you don't see this by the Rebbe and by the Rebbe most of the time. The one exception is Taka Tkiyah Shofar. At the Rebbe's praving Tkiyah Shofar, it's a serious zach. Nishnar dem, but that's one of the only times in the year where the Rebbe Taka takes out a Siddur Arizal with actual kavanas, and that's part of the whole situation as well. So that's an example where you see how the two worlds overlap. The world of Kabbalah, other Chassidism, and Chassidus Chabad. And so the theory behind it, the Kabbalistic technical theory, is that this is a time of Nesira. Like I said, this is where Chassidus Taka mentions Nesira a lot. So that's the next Nesira. So each Nesira is successively greater, and the stakes are higher. What's the next one? The next one is a historical one. Nesira Shahoisa Bepurim Bisman Mordechai ve'Esther. That was Taka big Nesira, and that was a Tzara Gedoyla Shehuchshechu Einem Shel Yisrael. And we know that was a Nesira of Shivim Shana Shel Galus Bavel. So take each one, whichever Nesira you feel like you know the most about. So there are smaller ones and there are bigger ones. And then here comes the key passage that the Rebbe was alluding to. And it says, Vav Beis Ayin Hey Yod, which the is Be'ezrus Hashem Yisbarach, I think. Hanasira Ha'asido Lias, Bizman, Shiyovim, Moshiach Tzidkenu, Hu Nasira Kaileles. And he uses first the Kabbalistic Kol Shita Alfe Alma Zun, HaKoilel Shel Shita Alfe Shana. So when Mashiach comes, that's going to be the ultimate Nesira, and that Nesira is on the largest scale. We had smaller Nesiras, a Nesira of the part of the day, a Nesira of a full day, a Nesira of a year. So think about that. Just imagine that whatever you know about the Nesira of Rosh Hashanah, so think of that, but it's 6,000 years. Whatever that means Lamaila, and whatever that means Taka Lamata, that it's 6,000 years. So that's the big Nesira. So now if the Nesira is so big, and we saw that when it comes to smaller Nesiras, it's nicht so pashat, so you could already imagine, man kann sich vorstellen, how scary the big Nesira is going to be. Lefichach heim kol eisam chav the Mashiach shenizkeru b'shas u'b'zayir HaKadosh Hashem yizakenu yesiv v'nachmeinu u'mala aretz deya. So because of that huge Nesira, which you now have more appreciation and context for when you compare it to the other Nesira, so now you understand where those chevlei Mashiach, the very, very scary chevlei Mashiach described in Shas and in Zohar, you understand how they fit in because they're describing the physical, gashmistic ramifications of this big Nesira that's taking place. And so that's the Seif Lamed Hey in this Kuntres Sfas Emes. And if you search in the Sefer Zimra Sa'aretz, in that 1932 edition, you'll find it on page Yud Aleph Amud Beis at the end of Ois Mem in that Sefer, Taka, the same Lashon, the same Nusach. That's where this Mechaber got it from. Right, so now if we look back at what the Rebbe wrote Lahoyer, Kuntres Sfas Emes, Lamed Hey, Rabbi Yaakov, Shekoydim Beis Mashiach, Tzarech Lias, and Asira Keleles, Vav, Alf Shnin, Bezel Inyan Chav the Mashiach. So that's what the Rebbe was referring to, but when you look it up, so now you understand the context that there's successively greater Nesiras, and the greatest Nesira is a Nesira that encompasses Vav Alfei Shnin, compared to a Nesira of Rosh Hashanah, which is just 1 year, and therefore you have Chav the Mashiach. So what's the Rebbe doing? What's the Rebbe saying when the Rebbe is quoting this, citing this, invoking this in this letter post-Holocaust to the Chevra in Shanghai? Clearly, this is referencing the fact that during the Holocaust, the Frierdiker Rebbe mentioned many times that this is Chav the Mashiach. In fact, if you open that Yom Yom right in the beginning, like the intro to Hayom Yom, which is also what the Rebbe copied from the Frierdiker Rebbe. It mentions very clearly about being nitzov and the chevlei Mashiach during the Holocaust. So to the Frierdiker Rebbe, Holocaust and chevlei Mashiach were synonymous. So the Rebbe Gedarkoi is looking for the Kairos basis. The Rebbe would do it to the Frierdiker Rebbe's Morim directly. So here the Rebbe is doing it in this letter and finding a Kabbalistic source and Kabbalistic terminology to say that, this is what we just experienced. We just came off of the great Nesira of Mashiach Tzidkenu, and those are the chevlei Mashiach that we just experienced. So this is a pretty notable passage in the Rebbe's letter. It's worth shtalang zachan, even if not for the interesting source, but just for the Teichen itself. And the source itself is also very interesting, and looking up the source, seeing what the source says, is also very interesting and gives you the proper context so you can appreciate what the Rebbe is saying. So that l'chayra would be enough. Now we know what the Rebbe was referring to. But that's not where Seif Lamed Hey ends, because although this is where the quote from Zimras Haaretz concludes, now Rabbi Yaakov She'altiel Niño has a ha'ara. So it says Aleph Hey, could be Omar Mechaber, Omar Ha, whatever. Inyan Zeh Mavel Harayan. This is actually terrifying. As I'm quoting it, as I'm copying and pasting it into my kuntras, I'm thinking about it and I'm realizing, I'm internalizing how scary this passage is. Because according to this Mekubal, who's sharing the Angenumene Divrei Kabbalah, Yani Kabbalah, Lefi, the Mahalach of the Chachmei Shivas Mekubal, the Lefiza Muchrech Liyas, Tzares Gedolos V'chavle Yoldes Kaidem Bias Mishichenu. That means that it's real. That means that it's actually happening. Not everyone at all times always was living with that awareness that Chavlei Mashiach are coming and they're scary and they're serious. But based on what it says here, based on the Nesira, so it sounds like it's going to happen. And there's no way to get around it because you need to have the Nesira. If it was just a Gemara and a Zohar that says there's going to be Chavlei Mashiach, so you could say, okay, maybe yeah, maybe no, maybe for Taich, maybe this, that. But you're coming and telling me that it's pashut like Kabbalistic science. Once you know what a Nesira is and you understand how the Nesira works in all these other contexts, and now you tell me this is the biggest Nesira of all, so the Nesira has to happen, the Chavlei Mashiach are going to happen. So this is terrifying. And then he adds a very interesting passage. V'mkein oisa hakabbalah sheyesh lanu mitoyda shabal peh mishem Rabbeinu Arizal. So there is a tradition that we have orally in the name of the Arizal. Because Galus is so long, because really the Gula could have or should have come just a few hundred years after the Churban Ma'ashin, just like it happened after the Churban Ma'ashin, and yet the Galus keeps on stretching. So there was a Kabbalah about Pef Arizal that because the Galus is so long, which itself is perhaps upsetting, disturbing. So you should know that what we're gaining, what we're benefiting from the Eirech Galus is that Lo Yiyu Oid Chevlei Mashiach. That was the Kabbalah, and that, as we'll see, was what this Mechaber previously believed to be true. So there's this Kabbalah of the Arizal, but it's Torah Shabbat Peh. There's no makar. He's saying there's no makar for it. But now, based on what this other Mekubal wrote in the Zimras Haaretz, this Rav Avigdor Azriel, based on what he wrote about the Nesir and the Chavlei Mashiach, Muzman Zagen, Nira, the Loi Mar Rabbeinu Agadol Chasam Alei. So even though it's attributed to the Arizal, but the Arizal is not actually behind it, Ella v'chulu v'doik, but rather, etc. v'doik, rather it's incorrect, rather it's wrong. Maybe he had a shot for the lashon in mind. I don't know. So, but he's proving from the Zimras Haaretz Biksav Keneged that Shmua, that Kabbalah Baal Peh, and it sounds like from him that based on whatever his knowledge was, he was not aware of other Mekairos Likan Ulikan. So there was a Kabbalah Baal Peh versus what it says here. Okay, so this outweighs the Kabbalah Baal Peh. So now, when you actually look it up, and you see not just what the Rebbe was quoting, but the Hemshech, so Kumta is that if the Rebbe is quoting the Reisha, Divrei Baal Zimras Haaretz, that there's the Nesira and the Chavlei Mashiach, and the Rebbe is not pointing at the Holocaust and saying, this is it. So if the Rebbe is accepting that Allah Lamaisa, so l'chayra, that means that the Rebbe also has to accept the Seifa, that what they say, B'Shem Arizal, is nishrichtik. And we'll get back to that soon, because there are essentially two sugyas here. The Reisha, the question of Chevlei Mashiach, Nesira, Holocaust, and the Seifa of this Shmua B'Shem the Arizal. So we'll get back to that as well. Interestingly, when looking around, looking into this to see what other Svarim are saying on these topics. So I saw those are Mitzayin at this very same Mekubal, Rabbi Yaakov She'altiel Niño, actually is Isaac in this topic in his other sefer. We mentioned that he had another sefer, Zera Yaakov Drushim, that his son printed a while later, and it was reprinted. I found, so I went to look it up. I found this is the new edition by the same Mochin that reprinted the Emes Liyaakov, the Sfas Emes. So they also reprinted the Zera Yaakov in Tafshinai and Dal, also in Yitzhak Chachma. And there's a drush Lamailas Eretz Yisrael. In the old print, it's page Tzadik Tesam at Beis. In the new print, it's page Reish Samach Dalad Reish Samach He. He has a few questions there, and then he says, "V'miyashav al koil k'derech darshanim in the drushim." So he says, we'll start with a hakdama yudua, a fact that we know. Sheyesh lanu kabbalah Rebbe Arizal b'inyan chevlei moshiach. So here he's saying the Kabbalah, and he's repeating it like it's the accepted Kabbalah, b'shem Arizal. Now, what's the Kabbalah? The chol elu achav the moshiach sheniskadu b'zer hakadosh b'talmud, that almost no one will survive. V'chayotze me'elu dvarim shmavhilin harayin. They're terrifying to the extent that the Gemara says, Yesiv v'lei nachmine, let it come. I don't want to see it. Interestingly, the Baal Zimra Sa'aretz himself earlier was paraphrasing that when he said, Interestingly, after Ersh saying that the Chavli Mashiach are real, he said Yesiv and Achmine. But in the Gemara, when they spoke about the Chavli Mashiach, they said Yesiv and Achmine. We don't want to see it. So the Kabbalah B'Shem Arizal is that this is Altzgeret if the Gula would come Kaidim Zmana a few hundred years ago. As we know, there are two Bechinas, there's Be'ita, Achishana, Zocho Achishana, Zocho Be'ita. So if it would have come earlier, that would be Achishana. But at this point, it's clearly not Achishana. Atashan is Arach Lenu Hagalis Kolkach, but we weren't Zeichet to the Achishana, but it's Be'ita. So the Kabbalah B'Shem Arizal is that Yedei Arach Hagalis, Li'iyah Eit Chav the Mashiach, Kol Elu She'amru Chazal. What's the reason? The reason is that in order for Mashiach to come, there has to be a big beer, a big tikkun, and all the Eilim, and all the neshamas need a beer until there's no psilas left in the world. So if we were Zaka and we would be metaking ourselves, mavar all the berudim through our maisim toivim, kavanas hatfilas, so then Malach HaMashiach would come take us. But Besinu Harabim, we're mekalkal. We don't have the koyach to metaking mavar all the berudim. So if Mashiach would come koidim zmanoi, so there was so much left that wasn't taken care of, so there'd have to be mavar all the berudim of achas, and that would be a big tzirof, more than being mitzar of kasav azav. And that tzirof, that's the kabbalistic taich to what the torah and Chavli Mashiach would be. It would be one huge beer and tzirof to fix everything that's not fixed yet, and after that, there would barely be any survivors. Echad me'ir, shnaim mishpacha. But HaKadosh Baruch Hu, b'rev rachma v'chasodov, karachim av al-bonim, chashav machshavas, the built yidach menu nidach, Hashem didn't want it to look like that. That would be pretty scary. So, lochin ma'asa herech lanu ha'galus, the fact that Hashem made the galus long is Hashem's choice. Hashem had a choice. Either bring Mashiach now and it's going to be this horror, or Hashem keeps on extending the galus. What do we gain by extending the galus? Not so much just to give us more time to bimvar everything. He makes it sound like he's being marich the galus and meyaser isanu ma'at barachmim. We talk about yisurim, but it's barachmim. You can tolerate it. It's not as bad as the Chavli Mashiach scenario. And through that, goy v'chivasa, he collects his debt. And we're doing the bit of a tikkun, or the yisurim are doing the bit of a tikkun, and we're all able to take it and survive, and we're all alive. So that's how it all works out and evens out through what Hashem chose to do, to be Mayrach the Golos. So now, the world will be ready, be Metukan, so you won't need the Chavli Mashiach. So Zel me'avas Hashem me'isanu. And that's the midah of Hashem, that your enemy, you want to punish him in one shot. But mi'ahuvay nifra mimenu ma'at ma'at. So this is this Yesoid, this Kabbalah of the Arizal, that with the Eirach HaGolos, I don't have the Mashiach, and this is his hasber to explain why that makes sense in a Kabbalistic context. By the way, I'll mention, even though it's not directly Negea, but it's pashut interesting, the next paragraph, Mamash, he writes, but here's the place to mention, I want to comment on Mashashamaiti Dibas Rabim. I've heard many people are saying, the riffraff out there are saying that they are waiting until this year, Shnas Tafresh, so this was written, this drasha was clearly written in the year Tafresh itself. As we saw earlier, that was when he lived. He printed his Sefer Emes Liyaakov in the year Tafresh Gimel. So he's darshaning in Tafresh, and he says people are saying that they're waiting for this year to pass. This is the year. Mashiach has to come this year. If he doesn't come this year, Tafresh, 1840, there was strong raid that people are saying that this is it. Either it happens or we give up. Why? Because it's stated in Zohar about Shnas, Tafresh, Alaf Hashishi, which people in Chabad should be familiar with it from how the Rebbe spoke about it, and the Rebbe gave his presentation on it of the Mayanas HaChachma, the science. But here's another example where context is important. If you only know the Rebbe Sikha, okay, it's a nice beer. If you know that in the year Tafresh, people were saying, we're waiting, and if Mashiach doesn't come, we give up, it gives it a different perspective. So that's what people were saying. So the Zayir says it. The logic is that there's a time for him to come, and like it's an appointment. If the person doesn't show up to the appointment, so this was Taka designated time. They were supposed to come. For whatever reason, they didn't come, and that's it. It's canceled. That was their perspective, and this was what people were saying. And he proceeds to debunk it, to give a whole context about Kitzin, not the focus here. Just figured I'd mention it because it's an interesting lashon. My thought when I was seeing it was that, unfortunately, those who are familiar with the history know that British Protestant missionaries, maybe from other countries as well, around this time started putting their focus on the Yiddish Yishuv in Eretz Yisrael as well. And we do know that they did have a certain measure of success. So question is, what's Taka Pshat? There was some measure of success in Eastern Europe as well, but for some reason Yerushalayim, Eretz Yisrael, stands out of it. And so one way of looking at it is that it was Taka just a very miserable time, Begashmias, and some of the weaker people saw an opportunity, financial opportunity. But this would be an interesting point, interesting perspective as to whether there were certain tmimim, noshim pshutim tmimim, Avdafka Poshet Mamish, maybe even Shtikl B'nei Torah, but Mimos, where this Taka broke them. That the year Tafresh came and went, and nothing happened. And so what are we doing? What are we working towards? What are we here for? And then here's this alternative messianic framework. So Ken Taka Zayin, could be that there were those that were broken by this and pushed by this into their hands. And B'chlal, this reminded me of another thought that I had recently, which is that it seems that Amol, B'chlal, people took the Kitzin seriously. It's not the last Ketz, by the way, that people took seriously. There was another Ketz, I don't remember the exact year now, the Tafresh Samach, Tafresh Ayans, or maybe a little earlier, Tafresh Chavs, I don't remember, somewhere after Tafresh, where they say that there was a big tumult about it in Poland and those lands, and one of the Polish tzaddikim got up and swore and said, I swear Mashiach is not coming this year, and he was doing it Pashat Lishma, so that people shouldn't be tzibrochen if the year came and went. Now they have an excuse. They can say, this tzaddik made it happen, he ruined it. So he took that achrayas on himself. So you see that people took Kitzin really seriously, and certainly the further you go back, there are many examples of people taking Kitzin very seriously, whereas today, a ketzahin, a ketzaher, you found another sefer, another. It just sounds like a curiosity. No one that I know or that I heard about seems to take it so deeply seriously. So interesting to think about why that changed. Maybe post-Holocaust, at this point where whoever is kept their faith is open to accepting that anything might happen, and there's no guarantee that anything will go exactly the way we assume and imagine. But also Taka be Pasha, that all people had real tsaris, and people were really miserable, and the Ketz gave them real hope. And if that Zmana Ketz came and went, then they were really broken, really tzibrochen. Whereas today, the galus of today is a bit of a different type of galus. People aren't necessarily counting down the minutes to be saved and relieved from their misery. And you hear people who comment generally about people these days getting too comfortable in galus, etc. So maybe it's connected. Anyway, just a thought, Maimon HaMusker, based on his Maimon HaMusker. At any rate, so you see that in his Rabbi Yaakov, in his Drashas, in the year Tafresh, we have a date, in the year Tafresh, he was still quoting this Kabbalah B'Shem Arizal as a Yisoid, and he believed in it, he took it very seriously, and a few pages later, in this Drasha, he then uses this to answer the kashas that he had earlier. What are the kashas? Chazal say that Hashem didn't let Eliyahu get the office to daven for the Gula. Why not? Why would Hashem want to prevent that? So his teretz is that if it would happen then we would have Chav the Mashiach, because we wouldn't be ready. So Hashem, it's the same vart. Hashem has this love for us, so he wants to prevent this from happening. Hashem is Chafetz Chesed. And he also throws in a line here, that's Takab Shat and Shemana Esrei, maybe Goyal of Neven Nehem, Ba'ahava. That the Gula is going to come, but it's going to be Ba'ahava. So, like I mentioned earlier, if the Ba'ava, the Mesiras Nefesh Ba'ava that was mentioned earlier by the Zimas Aretz is the same Ba'ava, so maybe there's a connection between the two things. So, Antaka, in this new edition of Rabbi Yaakov in Ha'ara on the bottom, and also in greater detail in the Toldos HaMachaber at the beginning of the Sefer, page 14, they say, we can prove that Emes Yaakov was written after Rabbi Yaakov. Because in Rabbi Yaakov, he quotes this Shmuah b'shem the Arizal and takes it with utmost seriousness. And as I pointed out, they don't emphasize this, but as I pointed out, he emphasizes that it's mid-year Tafresh. And we know that Emes Yaakov's Sfas Emes, he printed in Tafresh Gimel. So it seems that within the range of time between Tafresh and Tafresh Gimel, as he was working on this Chibur, he then came across this passage in Zimnas Haaretz, which he copied into his Kunches Sfas Emes, and then he chabtzich. He said, so that means, that's scary, that means my whole Yesod, that I believed in myself, that we were potter from chevlei moshiach, just like the people he was talking about that are scared of the cats, or the cat is going to come, and so he also went through his own transformation about how he was thinking about Mashiach. He had this idea, he had this image in his mind that Arizal told us, no chevlei Mashiach, we're good, we're safe, and all of a sudden he sees that the state that the chevlei Mashiach are coming, and it's Mavel Harayan. So Pashut, also in the chronology, we can see the order in which he wrote this stuff, but also the Rabbi Yaakov gives us context for what Kabbalah, what Shmuah he was alluding to, and he clearly himself believed in, that he's now chapping sich in the Kunches Sfas Emes, that Kanira Loi Mar Rabbeinu Hagadol Chasam Alei Elo V'chulu. Now, why is this Mechaber's discussion of this Kabbalah, of the Shmuah b'Shem Arizal interesting? Because really, this is yet another example of something where there is actually a whole corresponding sugya, almost identical, in Chabad. And that's about the famous passage, I think it's pretty famous passage of the Mittel Rebbe in the Sefer Sharet Shuvah, pretty close to the beginning, in the Sharet Shuvah, the end of Ois Hey. And here's another part where I told myself I'm not going to be Meirech, because it's Yudua Lefi Erech. Maybe after I complete my whole presentation here, would then be Kedai for someone to go on Takabi Malakit, all the quotes, all the Marmakaimas, from the Snai, from the beginning, be Masadir, the whole Inyan, as a standalone sugya. I'm coming out here from a certain angle of finding letter of the Rebbe and my presentation here, but it would Taka be nice and Geshmak to then see the whole thing rewritten, starting from the Mittel Rebbe, etc. So we're not delving into the Mittel Rebbe itself as its own sugya and quoting the whole thing by Riches. There is a whole interesting passage there. It's not just the Mittel Rebbe as well. There's another passage, a related passage in Pelach Harimayin from the Hillel Paritcher. It's also mentioned in this famous shtickle that begins Lahavan HaKushya HaYidua that Rebbe is mitzayin to in a few places, Lenoid Elami. It's also alluded to there. So, not being malakit, not going through all of that in granular detail, but all you need to know for the purpose of our discussion is that Mittel Rebbe, amid this sort of an interesting historical discussion there, he mentions about the history of the Shmadas, the Gzeres, interesting thing there that says that Ibn Ezra died al Kiddush Hashem, which doesn't seem to be known from elsewhere. So, in the context there of the Shmadas, the Mittel Rebbe writes, Ad sheba zmanei shel Arizal b'shin lamed gimel shenifter, Amar befeirush shebizmanoi dafka batlu hashmadas. So the Mittel Rebbe says, the Arizal said, clearly, Amar befeirush, doesn't give a marker, but Amar befeirush, that bizmanoi dafka batlu hashmadas, from now on there are no shmadas. And then later at the end of the Ois, he concludes again for his Ois, bizmana Arizal, shehayim b'chinas hatikun, b'nigle elav chachmas hakabbalah hamitis, batlu hashmadas, v'layi oid, chulu v'dal. Well, that's the famous line, batlu hashmadas of the Mittel Rebbe. So Mittel Rebbe is being miyachas to the Arizal, but there's no marker. So essentially, it's more or less Kabbalah Baal Peh, b'shem the Arizal, pretty much corresponding to what Rabbi Yaakov She'altiel Niño is also talking about. Now, before I continue, I should mention, since we're talking about this Kabbalah and the Shmuah and what the makar is, so there is one earlier makar before these makairos, although I don't know if the sefer that we're about to talk about is such a hush of a sefer. It's only interesting because it's the first one to mention it, but does it count as a mocker that is chashiv? I don't know. But it's a sefer called Vayakel Moshe. And in fact, in the new edition of Shari Tshuva from a bunch of years ago already, they were mitzayin in the Marmar Kremis in the back to be ma'ayin and Vayakel Moshe. And others who have this topic with Mittel Rebbe, it's been the topic in Ha'aris a few times over the years. So people who have written about it, at least one of them was also mitzayin to the Vayakel Moshe. So another not Chabad Sefer who is being Isaac in this Shmoy, also is mitzayin to Vayakel Moshe. Who's Vayakel Moshe? So Vayakel Moshe is Ramesha of Prague. He has a very short piece on the Hebrew Wikipedia, but in the from Nakov, Hamachlul, Hamichla, whatever the Nakudas are, there's a big erech there in Ramesha of Prague. And to make a long story short, we don't know exactly when he was born, when he passed away, but he seems to have been born around the year 1650, and he printed Vayakel Moshe in the year 1699 in Dessau, and then it's not clear what happened to him. So, second half of the 1600s, and all the history of Kabbalah in Prague, and who he was Makabel from, and his activities spreading Kabbalah, which is its own interesting, fascinating topic. The context and history of acceptance, spreading of Kabbalah in that part of Europe. And to the extent that you could say that if you had to list and categorize the different streams of Kabbalah, Mefitzei Kabbalah, so you have Chabad, you have other Chassidim, you have other Mekubalim in Eastern Europe, the Quran is Talmidim, you have Mekubalim in Yerushalayim in Italy. So it's almost like Prague is its own contained universe of its own history of Mekubalim and Kabbalah, and then influence of Shabtai Tzvi as well, etc. So this Ramesha Prague and the Hakdama to Vayakel Moshe has a whole Hakdama explaining the importance of Kabbalah and giving it sort of like a historical, spiritual framework. And there's a lashon there on page Zion Amud Aleph. He writes, "Mashehizr lanu or shivas hayamim, Mereinu b'Rabbeinu Hari asher amarnu b'tziloi nichya b'goyim u'v'yom of his chilu lisnoitzeitz nitzoitzis shel olam hatikun uviser lanu," and he was mavaser to us that miyama va'elach le'yiyah oid gzeres shmadas ba'olam. And it's quoted in a few places, but actually he repeats it again. If you search in the Sefer, you look in the Sefer, you'll see that a few pages later, Chas Gimel, he repeats again, Haraya, Hiftiach lanu shliyiyah gzeres shmadas kasher haya b'teres yishayim no'elam ha'churban. His syntax, mamish, sounds like someone speaking in Yiddish, translating it directly into Hebrew. But he clearly a big yisoy that him is davar pashut. Biser lanu hiftiach lanu. So again, I wouldn't call it a marker. Now we know what the marker is. Vayakel Moshe. No, not really. And interestingly, it's been pointed out that the Tzemach Tzedek at one place in Eretz Torah and Balak, talking about Atzilus and what Atzilus means. The Tzemach Tzedek Kedarkai, who as I mentioned earlier, used Mitzayin until Kumini Svarim. So he says, "B'Sefer Vayakel Moshe Kosav b'Inyan Acher b'Firush Atzilus b'Chlal v'Lo Yizehu Aderech she'Amar Rabbeinu Zal v'Gam b'Eitz Chayim ein Shum Zeichelis Varasoi v'Lo b'Tikunei Zoyar she'Misham Mekar Advarim." So he just rejects the Vayakel Moshe, doesn't know what he's talking about. So in the Tzemach Tzedek's world, the Tzemach Tzedek was Mekabel and Machshav a lot of Sifrei Kabbalah, but this one he's apparently not Machshav so much. So Nishkin Grace a Makar, but it just tells you that here's another instance where this Kabbalah, the Shmua, is clearly all around the Kabbalistic world, the Kabbalistic sphere, in all corners and in all times, in Prague in the 1600s, and Mittel Rebbe in the early 1800s, and this Mekubal in Yerushalayim in the mid-1800s. Each one is saying it without a direct makar from a previous place, but they all seem to know that Arizal said that Batlu Hashmadas. Interestingly, as we'll get to later, there's the kashas on how could you even quote this and say this. One of the big kashas is that before the Mittel Rebbe wrote it, there's already the Gzedas of Tach V'Tat. So interestingly, this Vayakel Moshe is also written after Gzedas Tach V'Tat, and yet he's still repeating it also with the ganze Starkheit that no more Shmadas. I'll mention parenthetically that there is clearly some general context if you look into the Arizal and Rebbe Chaim Vital and their torah and their self-conception of what they came to do. There clearly was a very strong moshiach element, an angle to it all. And there's an article you can find even online, Ha'ariv, Rebbe Chaim Vital, K'Mashiach ben Yosef. And it's clear that in those circles there were hopes for the year Shin Lam and Hey as the year of Geula, which the Arizal passed away right before. And the Emek HaMelech mentions the year Shin Lamed Hey, and then he quotes Yaakov Moshe also emphasizing Shin Lamed Hey. Shin Lamed Hey is the big year. So he quotes from Yaakov Moshe on that, Barichas, in this article. And then in this article, he's also mitzayin to this quote of that there won't be any more shmadas. So it all seems to be connected, that there was this Besudas HaGeula, a shtickle of the Arizal and Chaim Vital, even though we don't have a clear makar seemingly on the record for this Batlu Ashmadas, but in context it would seem to have been probably in the context of a larger implied Besudas HaGeula. And this Bechlal touches on the larger context, larger concept of Mashiach being an animating feature of Torah HaKabbalah v'Chassidus since the Arizal until today. And in other words, it's a feature, not a bug, you could say. It's come in different waves ever since the time of the Arizal himself. Bechlal, in the first few hundred years, from the Shins to the Tafreshes, those who were Hoilich b'Darkei HaKabbalah v'Chassidus and believed that there were spiritual changes taking place, so the Taka gave it a more of a kabbalistic language of what changed Lamaila. And so, for example, what state is Malchus in, and does Malchus need us to help it in the state of Galus, or has Malchus stood up from its state of Galus? And a few years ago, I once recorded about how even until through the 1800s, in the kabbalistic world, either the Yeshivas Mekubalim or even the Prushim, Talmidei Hagra that came to Eretz Yisrael, they had certain interesting minhagim with regard to Tikkun Chatzos, with regard to other things, where they had this Shmuah, this Kabbalah, that Epis, things now are not exactly the way they were before, and you can't do certain things that have to do with the Galus HaShechina the way you were able to do it before. So there were these, to use the term messianic elements to the world of Kabbalah and Chassidus, and it had a more technical Kabbalistic dimension to it back then. So I want to say that back then they had standards in order to make a claim about Mashiach and the times of Mashiach. You had to have a sophisticated Kabbalistic understanding and say that, Pi Kabbalah, this changed, that changed. You couldn't just come and say Mashiach is here or whatever, and there had to be a serious, sophisticated claim behind it. Akopanim. Another reason why this context is interesting is also because of the question of what do you do when you have the cheshbonis, you have the tainus, it's happening, this is the time, but then time keeps moving and it doesn't seem to be happening as predicted. So knowing this context can also be helpful. It's not, this has happened in waves, this has happened many times before. Now, before I get back to the Mittel Rebbe and to the Rebbe, I just want to point out that l'chayra, you could taina, maybe you're thinking it already, l'chayra, lav dafka, what the Mittel Rebbe is saying, or the Rabbi Yaakov Moshe is saying, is exactly the same as what the Yaakov Yaakov is saying, because Rabbi Yaakov She'altiel Niño kept on framing it dafka around chevlei Mashiach, that the Arizal said that the Eirech HaGolos means there will be no chevlei Mashiach. Whereas Mittel Rebbe, these other Makairas seem to be just saying that Batlu Shmadas. Now, Shmadas, as defined and described there, is not necessarily synonymous with the concept of chevlei Mashiach. The Shmadas are presented as this long history of all these gzeiras by the Churban and throughout the times of the Rishonim, as the Mittel Rebbe describes. Whereas chevlei Mashiach is a specific thing Chazal say is going to happen before Mashiach comes. However, Afal Pikain, even though they're not the same thing, but if you just look at it Pichatzonius, they do sort of seem like they're different variations of the same Shmuah being attributed to Arizal. It's just sometimes Shmuahs are Paishit Tzura, the Levish Tzura. We'll also see later from the Rebbe himself as to whether the Rebbe acknowledges this chiluk or not. Interestingly, in that article about the Arizal and Chaim Vital and thoughts or talk of Mashiach, the person writing there writes, it's a bit speculative, but he writes that if they were working with the year Shin Lamed Hey as the big year, which Reb Chaim Vital seems to have expressed later, and others certainly expressed later, the Emek HaMelech, etc., expressed later. So perhaps that's even why what pushed the Arizal to come to Eretz Yisrael when he did, because one cheshbon could be that if Mashiach is coming in Shin Lamed Hey, and Chazal use a lashon of Shavua, Shevan David Boboy, a 7-year cycle, so then maybe Shin Chav Ches already is the Shavua, Shevan David Boboy, so maybe the Chav the Mashiach begin from the year Shin Chav Ches. So that could have been why the Arizal came to Eretz Yisrael, And chevlei Mashiach could be defined in different ways. It's all speculative, though, but I'm mentioning it because I saw it in the process. And of course, the talk would be interesting to just go look thoroughly between all the Sifrei Kabbalah, the Kabbalim from Arizal and onward, as to whether they said anything on the topic of Shmadis, Bechlal, or chevlei Mashiach specifically. Also as to whether there was any acknowledgement of the year Tach, the Gzeres Tach V'Tat, which I already mentioned. Interestingly, I did see in the process that one of the big Mekubalim that was Isaac B'Teres Arizal was the Mayor Poppers, who came from Poland, came to Eretz Yisrael, and he was one of the Urchim of the Torah's Kabbalas Arizal, which was released to the public without a Seder, and therefore there were different Urchim who were massacred in different ways, so he's one of the Urchim, with an ayin. So Mechoin Havat Shalom, a few years ago, Tavshin Pei Beis, they printed a volume, Mitoiras, the Mayor Poppers, and they mentioned that he actually is an example of a Makubal who acknowledged Tach V'Tat, because he literally came from Poland himself. And they quote that he has a Chibur Torah, and in Parshas Bereshis he has a whole shtickle about the history of Kitzin. And he writes, and they quote, that the Ramban said the Ketz will be the year Kuf Yud Ches. Oilonu, it's not true, because there is a Zohar that, based on the Zohar, you would understand that the year Kuf Chof would be a Ketz, and Kuf Yud Ches and Kuf Chof are pretty close. And then, that was one Ketz, and then Kuf Pei was another Ketz, and then in Reish Mem, there was Reb Lemel Hamavaser, a whole fascinating chapter of history that was very well known at the time, but is almost forgotten today, that there was an Ashkenazi Mashiach, Reb Lemel, who came and told people that Mashiach was coming, Reb Lemlein, and then the Sitzach Iskalost Mashiach didn't come. I ran into this once because there are Christian Hebraic works that were printed around that time, and they have this whole text in Hebrew that they copied and pasted from book to book, where they wrote in Hebrew to the Jews, don't you see what happened? Reb Lemel came, and in the year Reish Mem, and nothing happened. So they were trying to weaponize that against the Jewish Olam. So even though Reb Meir Poppers is almost 200 years later, but he does mention it. He mentions that it's mentioned in Tzemach David. So you had that, you had the Reish Mem, and then in the year Shin Lamed was the Arizal, and you weren't Zeicha. And then in Shin Samach, there was Epis HaMulchama, and Reb Chaim Vital said that could be the Shnas Ketz, and instead he lost his eyesight. And then the year Tov Chaf is another Ketz, and Bavenisin Rabim from the year Tov Ches and on, Shana Achar Shana, we had chevlei Mashiach. He uses that term, that we had chevlei Mashiach. So Yiratzin Shinigal B'Mehera. So I don't know what year he wrote this, before Tov Chaf, Besmichas Tov Chaf. So he was sort of looking at it as, that Shnas Tach could be the chevlei Mashiach for the Ketz of Tov Chaf. So that's an interesting mucker. That Meir Poppers A is Bechlal, is a Makubal who's being misyaches to the Gzeres of Shnas Tach, and putting it into the framework, and also tying it to the concept of chevlei Mashiach, and he certainly doesn't mention any such shmua about bittul shmadis or bittul chevlei Mashiach, so it is a relevant data point. Another mucker that should be mentioned, at least in passing, is that Bishua Munshain in Migdal Ois, where he quoted that Lahaven HaKushya HaYedua that I mentioned earlier, Lo Noida Lemi. So it also mentions this idea that the Arizal, from the Arizal Batla Shmadis, so Munshan is mitzayin to the Sefer Shem Agdoilem, to the Erech of Rebbe Lezer Rekeach. The Bala Rekeach from the Rishonim Chidah, a whole arichas there about the history of Kabbalah. So there's a line there where the Chidah throws in, Aval Kashal Koicha Be'inyan Harois or Hashmadis, but Toikef Hatzaris, Kikvar Huvrar, Harbe, Ka'omar, Mipi, Kavoid Har, Yizatzal, Ugzeras Tach, Tam Yesh Bedavar. So the Chidah seems to bring in a kitzer that the Taka, the Shmadis, are weakened because it was Huvrar, Ka'omar, Mipi, Kavoid Har, Yizatzal. What about Gzeras Tach? So he is even mentioning the Kasha. What about Tach? Gzeras Tach, Tam Yesh Bedavar. So the Chidah also seems to be alluding to this Kabbalah, to the Shmua, about Shmadas Bechlal, and he also alludes to the Kasha of Gzeres Tach, which had also happened long before he wrote it as well. So like I said, going off into this, you could be mechalak perhaps between chevlei Mashiach and Shmadas, but as we'll see, Lav Dafka the Rebbe himself is mechalak. So back to the Mittel Rebbe. So in Chabad Bechlal, it's really only known from the Mittel Rebbe, like as if the whole Kasha, the whole thing begins from the Mittel Rebbe, which as we see, once again, is not correct. There's a larger discussion. There are many other Makkairis in play. So But it's also be'ikr known today. When you hear about it, Lefiyadach growing up, I think it was somewhat well known. When you hear about it, it's usually repeated more al tzakasha. Like the Mitla Rebbe said it, but like, what do we do with what the Mitla Rebbe said? There's Gzeres Tach even before the Mitla Rebbe. Never mind all the Gzeres after the Mitla Rebbe. So what are we to make of the statement of the Mitla Rebbe? Batlu Ashmadus V'layi Oid. So there are sikhs of the Rebbe about it, and there are letters of the Rebbe about it. There's even a minor that the Rebbe wrote to Munshine about it at one point that Munshine didn't receive at the time, but it came out later. And it seems that Munshine was giving the chiluk that you can say that maybe there are shmadis that are anti-religious versus other shmadis like the Holocaust, which wasn't anti-religious per se. That was the chiluk that was being offered. And I think I've seen it in other svarim, contemporary svarim. The Rebbe completely rejects it in that minor. And like I said, the topic it's been written about in the Kaiftsim a few times over the years. And this is all included in the part that I felt I don't need to be maidach to give a complete, detailed overview, both because it's been done before, or I'll leave it to someone to now do b'shleimus afterwards. But one of the sources that are mitzayin to those who are Isaac in this is that there's a sikh of the Rebbe from Yoim Simchas Torah Tavshin Yud Zayin. And as we'll see, this is not only connected to the Mitla Rebbe, but now that we saw this makar of this Sfas Emes Yaakov, we'll see that this sikha seems to have much to do with this makar that we finally, I can't say uncovered because it's been hiding in plain view, but it's been overlooked, ignored, neglected. Knowing this makar, seeing this makar, will also shed light on what the Rebbe said, Simchas Torah Tavshin Yud Zayin. The Rebbe was saying that Shmini Atzeres is a hamshach to Rosh Hashanah Yom Kippur. Everything that happens on Rosh Hashanah Yom Kippur, so we say the klita is on Shmini Atzeres. Rosh Hashanah Yom Kippur, it's scary. Shmini Atzeres is besimcha. Rosh Hashanah, we know, is inyan ha dormita. So dormita is another term that is somewhat related to Nesira. Dormita is like a slumber, and the two concepts seem to be connected in that there's a dormita, and then there's an Asira, somewhat perhaps like a mashal of a surgery where first is anesthesia and then there's the surgery. So there's a state of dormita that's related to the state of Nasira. So Rosh Hashanah, there's the dormita, Aliyah Sa'elames, Hachtara, Hamshacha, and the Gemara Hamshacha is Shmini Atzeres. The Rebbe says, just like you have it on the scale of a year, you also have it on the scale of a weekly thing. Every week there's also Aliyah Sa'elames, and there's a dormita, and there's a Hamshacha. And the Rebbe says, like we find this also historically, by Vriyas Adam Arishin Yamashishi, by Yapel Tardema La Adam, and then there was a Nasira, a literal Nasira, there was a literal Tardema, a literal Nasira, and then there's the Yichud after the Nasira, once the Nasira is concluded, so then you can have the Yichud Panim Panim, that's made possible. Here the Rebbe mentions the Inyan of Chabad, there's this idea of falling asleep out of Shabbos, right before Shabbos, this idea of Dormita, Ayin Sham. The Lashon about that is also interesting, but we can't go off into yet another topic. So the Rebbe is making this point, though, that you have it on a smaller scale and on a larger scale. You have it in Yemei HaShavua, and you have it Yemei HaShana. Yemei HaShavua, it's quick. Yemei HaShana, it's like a whole month. It's why does it take a whole month? Because Hamshach of Yemei HaShana is an Inyan Klali, and they're Mekatrigim, so it's a serious zach. It's like the whole Chedesh Tishrei, whereas the weekly one happens every Shabbos, and it happens much quicker. The Rebbe says, Azoy, says, Dodder Inyan from Yemei HaShavua v'Yemei HaShana, Azoy is b'chlalos for, and die Shis Alfishnin, as besoif Shis Alfishnin, is Faran, die Aliyah v'Siluk, was der von nimmt sich chevlei Mashiach, mit die alle Gzeres Rachman al-Itzlan. Und danach is Faran, die Hamshach, aber wie es Mashiach. So the same thing that happens on a small scale, Yemei HaShavua, happens on a larger scale, Yemei HaShana, so then you have it on the scale of Shis Alfishnin. The Rebbe uses the term Aliyah v'Siluk, and that brings Chevlei Mashiach with the Gzeres, and then you have the happy ending. The Rebbe continues, and the far bringen the Mikubalim, as das, was steht b'Shem Arizal, as noch Gzeres Tach v'Tat, wird schon mehr kein Gzeres nicht sein, schreiben sie auf dem, lav modern Arizal chosam alei, und wie man hat gesehen, as es da noch Gzeres. V'tam adover hu, weil es is Hamshacha Klalis, nehmt es ma, and therefore, Mikubalim say that which it says with Shem Arizal, that after, interesting, the Rebbe says after Gzeres Tach v'Tat, the Rebbe like inserts it into the Shmua, that there won't be more Gzeres, but when? After Tach v'Tat, okay, that's interesting itself. But anyway, the Arizal said there won't be more Gzeres. So the Kabbalim write, they bring this and they say that Lav Maran Arizal Chasam Alei, we saw, and the Rebbe adds, we saw that Taka were more. Well, and why
why could it not be true? Because it's Amshach HaKlalos, if the Tamad over who, if you could be Medayik and Hanocha, that it's Bamshach to that. It's Taka, just like we said, Yemei HaShavua is on a smaller scale, it happens quicker. Yemei HaShana is on a larger scale, so it takes a month. And then you have the Shis Alfishnin, so that's a very big one. So they have big Chav the Mashiach, Gzeiris, it takes time. And here we also see that the Rebbe is clearly not distinguishing between Chav the Mashiach and Shmadas. And here the Rebbe is saying that Kabbalim say, Shem the Arizal, won't be more Gzeiris, and yet we see that there will be Chav the Mashiach with the Gzeiris. So here we see the Rebbe is not distinguishing, making that distinction at all. So that's when the Kabbalim say, the Rebbe says. The Arizal didn't say it. No, das is schwer zu sagen, because the Mittler Rebbe brings the B'Shem the Arizal. How can you say that the Mittler Rebbe brought something that's not true? Can't be makabel that if you don't have the Mittler Rebbe in the picture, so you can say, who knows, the Arizal didn't say it. But if the Mittler Rebbe says it, so what's pshat? So the Rebbe said, "Be'efshar as the Mittler Rebbe bringt es, weil hat gewollt peulen durch Tfila oder durch dem, was wird abpasken in den Torah, auf zum Vatel sein oder akupane machlish sein die Gzeiris." Maybe the Mittler Rebbe said it because he wanted to be poil through Tfila or pasken to be Mavatel, or at least to be machlish, to weaken the Gzeiris. So on the one hand, it's not really true, and we don't know technically the Maskana if the Arizal said it or not. But so why did Mittler Rebbe bring it? Mittler Rebbe brought it. Yeah, it's this kavana that's it's a tefillah or it's a psak and Torah, and that will hopefully be helpful and have an effect on the Gzeiris. And I'll get back to the nature of the Rebbe's teretz here, which itself is worth dwelling on at least for a moment, but that will be in a bit. So why was the Rebbe saying all this? The Rebbe said, it's Freitag for Nacht, and it's Shmini Atzeres, and it's Besium Shis Alfishnin. We have all three, but the Rebbe is not saying it in a negative sense, it's saying it in a positive sense. And after all that, then you have the Amshacha, then you have the good part. So now we're ready for the good part on all three levels. It's already Shabbos, it's already Shmini Atzeres, it's already L'chayra, the Rebbe is implying after the chevlei Mashiach. So therefore, now we can go straight into the Gula. That was the word the Rebbe was saying. The dark of the Rebbe to Arizal bring and the mile of the particular time that the Fabring is being held. So that's another way of Arizal bringing the word, the idea that, wow, you have this triple thing, and we already had the hard part, now we're up to the good part. So that's how it's in Sichas Kodesh, and those who discussed Mittler Rebbe are mitzayin to this Sicha. However, this Sicha was actually written up, and Muga, L'chayra was written up for Kovetz Lubavitch, for the feature. They used to put quotes from the Rebbe's latest Farbrengens in the Kovetz Lubavitch, and then from there it's in the Hisafis, Tilakut Sichas, the early volumes, so you can find it, Takut Sichas Chelik Beis, Hisafis, page 651. So they have this Vart of the Rebbe, but 2 paragraphs are omitted. I believe the paragraph that mentions that just like you have it, Yemei HaShavua, Yemei HaShanas, you have it B'chlolos, the Shis Alfishnin, the Chevlei Mashiach. I think that's there. That's part of the Vart. But the whole the Farbring and the Mikubalim, Shver Tzazagen, those 2 paragraphs are omitted. And based on that, speaking of Lahak and Teres Menachem, so in Teres Menachem Chelik Yud Ches, page 101, they printed it the way it's in the Yisofis Kotesichas, but they Kedarkam to put in Yonim for the Hanocha Biltimuga back in the footnotes in Ara 43, they put it back in the footnote, and this is how they rewrote it. They wrote, when the Rebbe said in the Far B'nengim the Mekabalim, the way they wrote it in Hebrew was Ulaho'er mimasha matzinu b'sfarim, and in parentheses Nemuki Eirachayim Oidois Tivrei Mekabalim. So what? So they're teaching. They decided that the Rebbe, when the Rebbe said the Far B'nengim Mekabalim, the Rebbe was referring to the Sefer Nemuki Eirachayim. The Sefer Nemuki Eirachayim is a Sefer from the Mooncatcher on Eirachayim, the feast Seder Simone Shulchan Aruch Eirachayim. Where does this Maramakim come from? This Maramakim Taka comes from the Rebbe himself elsewhere. Where, as we mentioned earlier, the Inyan B'Shem Arizal is also mentioned by the Bill of Parach and Pelacharim and Shmois, which was printed in the year Tavshin Tezvav. And there it says that there's the musik of that is Yeridis, Va'aliyas, there is Rishonim, there were Shmados Gzeiris, Achman Letzlan, then Bizman Arizal, there was an Aliyah, Ubatal Gzeiris, V'achak Shenestalek Arizal, Nechshach Ktsas, then there's an Aliyah Gedoyla, through the Baal Shem Tov Talmidim. So he mentions this idea of Batal Gzeiris, not that Arizal said it, but that it was Batal, but it's also ups and downs. It was dark after the Arizal, then the Baal Shem Tov came. So that's how the Hill frames it. Don't know if you saw what the Mittler Rebbe wrote, or it's He's just saying it independently the way he heard it, from wherever he heard it. So when they printed that Chedek Kapel Charimin, which still has the Pesach Davar from the Rebbe, where the Rebbe signs his name, sort of behemshech to the Tov Shins, that decade, the first decade of printing. So there were a number of Svarim that Kanida were Shirayim, or behemshech to that, where the Rebbe was still printing it out, Reish of Kahas. I didn't go check when the Rebbe stopped signing his name to Svarim like that, but there are a few Svarim, certainly from the Tov Shin Yud, that still have that format. So the Rebbe says in the Pesach Davar that he added Siyunim in the back. If you look at Siyunim in the back, it says Ha'ara. With regard to the Shmada, C Shari Tshuva Mitla Rebbe, C Eish Lavram with B'Chach, and C Nemuka Eida Chayim, the Baal Mechaber Sefer Minchas Elazar, Simon Samachas. So Kanira, based on this Ha'ara, and Titus Menachem, they decided that in Tafshin Yud Zayin, when the Rebbe said Nukubalim say that's not true, the Rebbe is referring to the Nemuka Eida Chayim, which was Mitzayin to here. First, let's see, what do the Eish Lavram and the Nemuka Eida Chayim say? So one is responding to the other. So we'll just look straight in the Nemuka Eida Chayim, but you can look it up in the Eish Lavram separately as well. It's like a print in the Eish Lavram. But the Nemuka Eida Chayim writes, I saw a Shveda Zach on the Eish Lavram, Lagoyin Atzadik Nubitshach Zal. He wrote, the question in Sim Samachas is about Piyutim. What's the whole story with Piyutim and Yiddishkeit, inserting Piyutim into Shemin Esrei, into Berchas Kriya Shema, and all that, which is obviously a big part of the Siddur, the Machzer, for many Kehillas. But l'chayr is also shver. So the whole sugya. So Eish Lavram says, "V'yesh gamkein makim leimar shemehariz avahola shehuftuchu am bnei Yisrael sheliya oid gzera shmat chas v'shal marabim. V'Hashem yisbarach yazer v'chulu nochen lemayit mileimar b'Shabbos kodesh dvarim ha'ma'oririm derech oitz v'yagen kegoyim b'Shabbos shebein Pesach le'atzaras ha'piyutim." There are certain Ashkenazi piyutim that were said between Pesach and Atzaras lezecher those who were killed in the Crusades. So the Eish Lavram B'Chach is saying that in this question of saying Piyutim, not saying Piyutim, another Sfar we can mention with regard to that class, that category of Piyutim is that from the Arizal Am we were promised no more Gzera Shmad, Chas V'Shalom, Al Rabim. So therefore, the world of the Mekubalim, things changed, and therefore our Hanhagas should change. The things that we said before shouldn't be said now. So he's also sort of doing a version of that. So here's yet an independent. Another makar, Baal Peh, saying this, that everyone knows B'Shem the Arizal. So now we have Yaakov Moshe, B'Tel Rebbe, Yaakov She'altiel Niño, Eish Lavram, each one independent of the Hill, all independent of each other. And this similarity to, therefore, maybe we should even change our Hanhagas. We shouldn't say this Piyutim anymore. So the Munkacher, the Nemuka Eida Chayim quotes this. And he says, Udvar of Zal, Tmuhim, Masha Amar, Shehuftuchu, Heichom Matzino Klal Haftacha Zu, Vu gefindt man Azah Haftacha. Adarabah, the biggest Shas Hashmad is the Shnas Tach, and that's 90 years Le'erach after the Arizal, and it was already predicted by the Zohar. The Eish Lavram says that Sha'az Chuschal Zman Agula, that's true, but the fact that it's delayed, that Gufa, that's Chav the Mashiach. It's ever since then, it's Chav the Mashiach till Mashiach will come. So he rejects the Shmuel, the Haftacha. He says, where's the Haftacha? He doesn't reject the Gula part, but says, Adrabah, that is the delay, and the Tzaris is Chav the Mashiach. I should point out that this is actually a big Yisoid by the Munkacher. The Munkacher had a big Torah about Chav the Mashiach. And there's an entire kuntris that was put together by his Talmud through his instruction called Mashmiya Yeshua. It was printed b'smichas to World War I. And already on the Sharblat it says that the kuntris is all about that Kirak mitoich tzara v'chav the Mashiach elu yamtzienu pedusar revacha. So Chav the Mashiach, the Tzaris, was a big Yisoid in the Torah Munkacher. Recently, the Macha in MS that we print, the Munkacher Svarim and everyone from that dynasty included it in a new volume that they called Chamisha Mamoris Nesafis. The Nesafis Lashon Akeva bothers me every time, especially that it's in the title of a sefer. But what can you do? It was printed in the year Tavshin Pei Beis, and it's included there, and they write about it in the Akdama. So Chav the Mashiach was a big topic by the Munkacher. Maybe looking up his kuntris, Mashmi Yeshua, will contribute to this topic as well. To him, Chav the Mashiach is a davar pashut, and Arizal, Haftacha, Kaifer and Gansen, no such Haftacha never happened. Arizal didn't say it, and the Tzaris are happening, and Tzaris are a big, important point to him. And then at the end, he says, by the way, Divrei Atzadik al Eish Avram, he has other Bikairis, other pratim there in the Eish Avram. And he says, B'chlal, the Eshel Avram, it was written, B'li Bechinu B'kairas, and it wasn't meant to be printed, and I complained a number of times that the Meitzil Or is printing stuff in his name that make no sense. However, in this case, whether or not that is a good critique of the Eshel Avram, but in this case, Eshel Avram certainly was quoting, as we saw, a pretty widespread shmua that has many Mekairas. So you don't want to be mekabel the shmua as einzach, but just to be mezalzel and say, what is this haftacha? It never happened. Clearly there is, especially in Chabad, Mittel Rebbe says so, clearly there is something to it. It's not the way the Munkacher completely dismisses it. So anyway, so the Munkacher has this line, Heicha mitzinu klal haftacha. So it seems like in Teres Menachem, when they reinserted it into the footnote, so the Rebbe said they're bringing the Mikubalim as das was steht b'shem Arizal, schreiben sie auf dem, lav moran Arizal chasam aleh. So they decided that's who the Rebbe is referring to, and they rewrote it. They wrote Masha Matzinu b'sfarim Numukar Erachayim Oides Divrei Mikubalim Hine Lav Moran. So they rewrote the sentence just based on their own Havana, that maybe they figured that the Rebbe wouldn't be referring to Nimuka Erachayim Alta Mekubal, that wouldn't be the title that Rebbe would use. So instead it's the Svarim say it about the Mekubalim. So the Mekubalim quote the Arizal, and the Svarim respond and say Lav Moran. So they even rewrote the language based on the assumption that it's the Nimuka Erachayim. But based on what we see, what we've seen, what we saw until now, maybe it was already obvious to you when I was already reading the Sikha. It would seem pretty clear to me, pretty obvious to me, that when the Rebbe was talking in Simchas Torah Tafshin Zayim, I think the entire Sikha, that entire segment of the Sikha, was based directly on that same amount of makom from this letter from Tafshin Vav, based on the Kuntres Sfas Emes and the Sefer Emes Liyaakov, both the part that's quoting the Zimra Sa'aretz and the Ha'ara of Rabbi Yaakov She'altiel Niño. What's the Rebbe's big yesod there? Azoi is the Inyan from Yemei HaShavua Yemei HaShana. Azoi is Bechlalus from the Shis Alfei Shnin. As B'Seif Shis Alfei Shnin is voran der Aliyah B'Siluk. Was der Fun nimmt sich chevlei Mashiach mit die alle Gzeres Rachmana Letzlan. Und danach ist voran die Amshach B'Vias HaMashiach. That corresponds directly to that line in the Sfas Emes from the Zimras Aretz, that Hanasira Ha'asida Liyas was man Shav Mashiach Tzidkenu Hu Nasira Keileles Call Shita the Shell Shita Alfei Shana, Lefichach Heim, call Esim Chav the Mashiach, Shnizkulu B'Shas B'Zer HaKadosh. Seems directly corresponding to this makar, and that's where the Rebbe took the whole concept, idea behind this vart in the Sikha. I should just point out there is one difference, that in the makar it doesn't mention Erev Shabbos at all. Instead, it's day, night, Rosh Hashanah, Purim, the original Purim, and the Geula, versus by the Rebbe doesn't mention the day and the night. Instead, the Rebbe mentions the idea of Erev Shabbos. And Mistama, to understand that Shinoi would be necessary to be Ma'ayin Taka in the inyan of Durmita and the Sira of Erev Shabbos, which the Rebbe himself, in part of that Sikha that I didn't really focus on, the Rebbe said that what's Taka the Makar for sleeping Erev Shabbos, Shteit Nishtan Kabbalah. So there is something here where Kabbalah didn't emphasize it, and Dafka Chassidus Chabad emphasizes this Erev Shabbos thing much more. So one would have to go study that separately, individually, to get to the bottom of that. But it seems like, as the Rebbe himself indicates, in the world of the Kabbalah and their Kavanas, they didn't have a Kavana and an Anhaga for Erev Shabbos, whereas in Chabad, there was this inyan of Anhaga on Erev Shabbos that relates to this. So at any rate, the Rebbe replaces the day and the night with Erev Shabbos. But otherwise, this idea of that is the smaller scale, and then there's the year, and then there's the Geula, seems pretty directly taken from this source. But as we saw, after the Sfas Emes quotes the Zimra Sa'aretz, he then writes a comment that's, as they say in Ivrit, mitbakesh. It sort of is asking for itself to be made. So the Rebbe does the exact same thing. First, the Rebbe makes the point that he wanted to make Legabe the Vart in the Sikha, that there are three levels, and the punchline would be that right now we have all three. But once you mention that because of the 6,000 years and the big Hamshacha, Kailelas, there are chevlei Mashiach, so then kommt the Kasha. So the Rebbe continues and says, and the far bringen the Mekubalim, as das, was es steht Hashem Arizal, schreiben sie auf dem, lav moran Arizal chasam alei, v'tam adavar huval, says Hamshacha close into man. That seems to correspond very directly to the Haggah of Rabbi Yaakov She'altiel Niño that says, "Oy, you told me this chevlei Mashiach, so v'mkein oisa kabbalah sheyesh lo b'torah sheba'al peh b'shem Rabbeinu Arizal, nida the loy mar Rabbeinu Agadol chasam alei ela v'chulu v'doik." So not only is this mamish the exact same lashon, the Rebbe B'dibur apparently said lav maran Arizal chasam alei, which mamish corresponds to the lashon of Rabbi Yaakov She'altiel Niño, the loy mar Rabbeinu Agadol chasam alei. So that itself is a pretty strong match. But if you actually think about it, if you compare the lashon of the not just the lashon, the taina of the Munkatcher versus the taina of Rabbi Yaakov She'altiel Niño, it's really two different tainas. The Munkatcher said, "Hey Chan, I never heard of it, lo dvarim mi'olam," whereas the Emes Yaakov is confirming that it brings it from the Arizal, and in fact he believed it in himself, as we saw. But then he found a heichacha from elsewhere that Muzman Zagen, that even though it does exist, it's b'shem the Arizal. Muzman Zagen the loy mar Rabbeinu Agadol chasam alei. That's a lashon when you acknowledge that it exists, but it's not a good marker. So that fits, and the Rebbe's lashon fits directly with that. And like I said, it's the whole context, the whole binyan of what the Rebbe is saying literally corresponds paragraph to paragraph with this marker in the Kuntres Fas Emes. And because the Rebbe had mentioned the Yesod and the Reisha, which was more directly negated to the Sikha, so you have to mention the Sefer, the Tain and the Sefer, because Haba Hatalia. So now there's an extra twist, and in Chabad, we can't just stop there and say, oh, Lav Maran Harizal Chasam Alei, because in Chabad, the Mittel Rebbe brought it. So the Rebbe is making this connection, saying, hey, what Rabbi Yaakov She'altiel Niño is saying, Lav Maran Harizal Chasam Alei, that's the same thing Mittel Rebbe said. The Rebbe is not being mechalik between the two. So you can't just say there's no good marker, even though we don't know what the Mittel Rebbe's marker was, but Mittel Rebbe himself is a marker. So the Rebbe said different tarets that after as Mittel Rebbe bringt this about called Poilen Jich Tefillah or Uppaskanin and Torah to Mevatel Zayin or Kapanim Machlish Zayin. And that itself, like I mentioned earlier, alluded to earlier, is also seems like it's an important yesod in how to regard these types of Makaidas. When Makaidas seem to say something confident, there's a confident prediction, and yet the Metzias seems to be otherwise. So here we have an example where the Rebbe seems to say clearly that something with which the Mittel Rebbe wrote azoi, like a psak, like it's a fact, it was b'derech tefillah, it was the hope that it's going to be through a psak and Torah, to be mevatel, to be machlish, v'dayla maven. I should also mention in passing that there's actually a sikha of the Rebbe with regards to the Fidik Rebbe. That in the beginning of the Mems, the Rebbe, it's printed in Sichos Kodesh, the Rebbe Taka asked a similar kasha on the Fidik Rebbe. The Fidik Rebbe said, La'al Tashuv, La'al L'Gula, let's taka pshat. And in the original Sikha, the Rebbe said that even though the Fidik Rebbe said it, Lav Dafka, it's a Dover Muchlat, and all the Gedolim, they saw something and they said something based on what they saw, but as time goes on, we see that there's more context. So that's something the Rebbe even said. Al derech, they're not exactly the same, but sort of a similar general framework about the Fidik Rebbe as well. V'yesh laharich, but also v'ein laharich. So at any rate, back to our discussion, it seems pretty clearly that once you take the time to understand what the Rebbe was saying, what the Rebbe was quoting in that letter in Tafshin Vav, it corresponds very strongly to what he said in Tafshin Yud Zayin. But if you ignore what the Rebbe said in Tafshin Vav, so then you'll also fail to get what the Rebbe said in Tafshin Yud Zayin properly. And like I said, I think they incorrectly rewrote it to inject the Nemukah Erde Chaim when that talk was based on the Kuntres Fas Emes, not just that point, but the point that came before it, and the 2 points are connected to each other, just like they are in the Makar. You only know that if you actually take the time to look at these Makaidas and take them seriously. But if you don't, then you'll ultimately, the more time goes on and the more you write on the topic, the more you're likely to write things that are partially incorrect. On the hand of the Vayter, if you ignore the Rebbe's Makaidas, so then you're failing at understanding the Rebbe's Torah. Back to the point, Taka, about the Holocaust as chevlei Mashiach. So in Tafshin Vav, the Rebbe is basically saying that that's the pshat in the Holocaust. And therefore, those who write about the Rebbe in the Holocaust, which is its own sugya, this is an important marker that should be part of the picture. That this is what the Rebbe wrote in Tafshin Vav. That's befedish, based on Kabbalah, it's the Inyan of chevlei Mashiach. Interestingly, it's not the only time the Rebbe used the term chevlei Mashiach. There's a sikha of Aleph Teresh Chodesh Bar Cheshvan Tashim Mem Gimel, printed in Esvaidius. The Rebbe said, "For kol kitzin, for ovu kol chevlei Mashiach, Kol Agzerus Ushmadas Rachman al-Tzlan She'eru B'Dor HaKodim L'fnei Kama Asar Shonim Bilvad. I'm reading just from the Hebrew. I assume there's audio as well. But the Rebbe said, Kol HaKitzim, and we already had the Chevlei Mashiach, all the Gzeres and Shmadas that happened in the previous Dor just a few decades ago, and there are those who still witnessed it. Gzeres and Shmadas that we never had, Mashach Kol HaDoros, and the Rebbe repeats the Fidik Rebbe about the slap, the mashal of the slap. So as late as Tafshim Gimel, the Rebbe casually said that was the Chevlei Mashiach. You can also find the Likut Sichas, Chiluk of Zion, Tazriya Aleph, which is a Likut from Tafshim Daled the next year, based on a Sicha of Tazriya Tafshim Aleph, although I didn't see this line in the original. But in the Likut it says, Befrad la'achrei di alle gewaldike mu'uyim dike gzeres u'shmadas die Chevlei Mashiach was jeden seinen schön durchgegangen und befragt bei der Reinu zeha achrim. So the Rebbe is giving a limud schos on if a yid does something, but the Rebbe is mentioning that after the Gzeres and Shmadas, the Chevlei Mashiach that we experienced befrat the last door, and there's a 51 that says so it's still being quoted and used in Likut Sichas and Tafshim Dal. On the other hand, compare what the Rebbe said early Yud Kislev of Tafshim Daled, but we're not going off into comparing all the Sichas. Back to the letter from Tafshin Vav, the Rebbe concludes the letter, as I mentioned earlier, the Rebbe circles back around to it at the end of the letter. The Rebbe says, V'asayim me'inyan ha'psicha, be'inyan ha'nesira, she'tachlisa, she'yiyah hachzar as panim be'panim. The Rebbe adds in parentheses, U'k'meishahu al pi pashat gamkein. The whole point is, hachzar as panim be'panim, she'zeu be'erev Shabbos, v'ach gach yiyah zivik panim be'panim be'yem ha'Shabbos, okay, and yiratzin, she'gili or hadach, b'rim torah, etc. Interestingly, you also see that already in Tafshin Vav, the Rebbe introduced this Erev Shabbos and Shabbos, which isn't in the Makar, in the Sfas Emes Yaakov. So you see that when the Rebbe looks at the Makar, when the Rebbe repeats it, the Rebbe turns it away from the daily thing to Erev Shabbos, Yom HaShabbos, already there, directly in connection to the Makar. So therefore, it's certainly not Kasha that in Tafshin Yud Zayin, the Rebbe repeated it out Erev Shabbos and Shabbos, but yet it seems clear to me that Rebbe is clearly using that Makar as the Makar, and to the Rebbe it's Alt Ein Zach. I should also mention that in the Sicha of Eira Tafshin on Beis, the Rebbe mentioned the inyan of Dermita out of Shabbos. The Rebbe was talking about Hecht, who passed away at the time, out of Shabbos. So the Rebbe mentioned the inyan of Dermita. So when they wrote it up, and it's printed in Sefer HaSichas, page 270 through 273, it looks like the Urchim decided to be marchiv on that inyan, to write it up nicely. So they brought in this whole inyan that there's Dermita and Nesira, both out of Shabbos and Rosh Hashanah, and B'chol L'Shis Alfi Shinin. I don't see it in the original, but I think it was the Derech HaUrchim to do that. Now, Ara 40, they're Metzayin to the Kuntra Svas Emes, and here they actually quote it, and they quote a big part of the passage there. So this is the one other place where this inyan was brought back into the Rebbe's Torah. It could be that the Urchim, they noticed it from the letter, and they decided to use that, to use other parts of the Rebbe's Torah to enrich the Sicha over here. So maybe they noticed it from the letter, maybe they noticed it from the Sicha. So maybe I'm not the first one to notice it, because where else would they have gotten to this Maramakim from? But at any rate, now it's part of the Torah of the Rebbe from Aleph and Beis, and that's sort of the backstory perhaps as to how it got there. And that's another angle, therefore, anyone who's interested in this topic, that's another angle, this Sicha of Be'eron and Beis. And now you can see all the Mekayros. Taka in the Kovtzi Pulpulim, in Eretz Yisrael, there have been a few shtiklach on Nesira and Teres Chabad, the Malakat in Yonim of the topic of Nesira and Teres Chabad. There's a Kovtzi Pulpulim, Haril Lefnei HaMelech, from Tafshin and Tes. There's also the Hatamim, Beis Mashiach, and Tafshin Samach Beis, Samach Gimel. And they bring this inyan at the end, and they're mitzayin to Be'era Tafshin on Beis, and they're mitzayin to this Kuntris Sas Emes via Be'era Tafshin on Beis. But as far as I could tell, I don't think anyone has yet put all these Mekayos together, meaning Sai, Tafshin Vav, and Tafshin on Beis, and put it all together. Never mind to combine Tafshin Vav and this Sas Emes Yaakov, to combine it with the whole Shmadas discussion of the Mittel Rebbe. So all of these discussions, as I've seen them until now, are lacking in that they did not have the full picture. Shlemus Inyan, I should mention that there's one other place where the Rebbe was mitzayin to this Makar, to the Sfas Emes Yaakov, and there the Rebbe actually spells out the name of the Mechaber, and that's in the Ha'aris of the Rebbe to the Chabad Machzer. It seems to have been originally printed in the Hisafis to the Kuntres Hemshech Chodesh Tishrei Tavshin Daled, which was printed as a Kuntres in Elul Tavshin Yud Gimel, and now it's also in the back of the Machzer. So the Rebbe was telling sich on that in the Machzer it says, Yom HaKippurim Shechol B'Shabbos, by Mincha, we don't say Vanis Filasi. So the Rebbe was going through every prat, and the Rebbe went through this prat. What are the Makaidas that the Rebbe saw was Mitzayin? The Rebbe says, Si Shulchan Aruch Eir Chaim Tavish Chav Beis, Avol B'Sefer Emes Liyaakov Le Rish She'altiel Niño Kunches Fas Emes Iftes Hevi Deus Mekubalam Loimar Vanis Filasi, and that you should say Avarachamon, not Avarachamim. Kivin Shumils the Tmiya, Valei Shamati Herabazeh, Nidbus Machzer al Pi Psak Rabbeinu Hazaken in Shulchan Aruch that we don't say. B'chein Shinisi that we say Avarachamim, not Avarachamon. And Ataka, as the Rebbe's Mitzayin, Ataka is in that Kuntres Vasemes Siftes, page Shin Pei Gimel, the new edition. And again, the Pnim is the Zimmer Sa'aretz, and there's a Hagav, the Mechaber. So the Pnim from the Zimmer Sa'aretz is about Avarachamon, Avarachamim. And there's a Hagav of the Rabbi Yaakov She'altiel Niño that Harav Achos Eir Chaim De La Rosa, who was also a big Mekubal in that circle of Yeshivas and Mekubalim, he wrote in his work on the topic, on the Indian of Kavanas, all the Mekubalim had their Machberasin with their Hayrois. He wrote that Shoshani Yom Kippur Shechol B'Shabbos, you say Avarachamim, and you say Vanis Filasi. Kemedum or Kadoimeli Shekach Onunoyegem Bekahal Chasidim V'Abaycher Yivcher. So again, you see that the Rebbe is taking a marker like this, these types of Makaidas, into account and comparing it to our minig. And l'chayra, I would argue that in many cases, if all you have is a Shulchan Aruch L'Alter Rebbe versus something that some of these kabbalist firms say, even if it's not mentioned in Chabad Makaidas, often those Kabbalah Makaidas might be a better source, because the Alter Rebbe Shulchan Aruch B'chalal is not written lefi these types of Makaidas. The Alter Rebbe Shulchan Aruch, as I've mentioned many times, I don't know if it's been recorded, the Alter Rebbe Shulchan Aruch is pretty much written as if it's Nusach Ashkenaz. So the logic and the Yesodus and the Makaidas of what a Chassidish Nusach looks like based on Arizal, you're better off looking at what the Yeshivas and Mekubalim are saying versus what the Alter Rebbe Shulchan Aruch is saying. However, in this case, to the Rebbe, it seemed like a milsed tzmiyah. It was too surprising to rely on them, so he quoted it, but he said it didn't rise to the standard that it was fully convincing. Obviously, if you want to understand the Indian itself, you'd have to look up the Makaidas, Mekubalim, and other Chassidish Kreisen, other Chassidish Sfarim that write about it. We're not getting into that here. But at any rate, the Rebbe did quote from it as a chashuv makar that needs to be taken into account and needs to be dealt with. And as I already said before, this is not really a chiddush. If you look through the Rebbe's yachas, the Rebbe's attitude in these types of contexts, you'll see that the Rebbe quotes, this is just, in this case, this was the chibur. But there are many other such chiburim up until the Rebbe's time that the Rebbe used for these purposes. And anyone who wants to become an expert and be oisik in the Alter Rebbe Siddur and the Chabad Machzer, if you're somehow filtering out, ignoring these types of Makaidas, and of course, at this point, it's not just the Makaidas up until the time of the Rebbe, but today you have Machon Avat Shalom and many others. Like I said, there's a big renaissance of chiburim in this field. So nowadays, you'd have to be up to date and see what new chiburim there are as well. And I think that would be continuing in the kav of the Rebbe to be up to date in what those circles are writing on these topics. And Mistam is also a lot of chaymer from Kisvei Yad, from previous doiris that the Rebbe could have had if it had been printed earlier, but now it's only being printed now. So if you're going to try to talk about the Alter Rebbe Siddur, the Chabad Machzer, but you're ignoring and filtering out these types of Makaidas, then I would pretty much say you have no idea what you're talking about, and I'm not sure what you're even doing. And this is pretty clear from the Rebbe himself, that the Rebbe understood implicitly that these sources have to be part of the discussion. I'll mention that the Rebbe wrote his name as Rabbi She'altiel Niño, which makes it sound a little bit like maybe the Rebbe is implying that She'altiel is his family name, that his name is Ri, Bekitzer for Rabbi Yaakov, and the last name is She'altiel Niño hyphenated, as I mentioned earlier. But like I said, based on everything that I have seen, including what he writes in Akdama to Kuntres Vasemes, it seems like his name was actually Rabbi Yaakov She'altiel, and his last name was Niño, and everyone else in his family's name was only Niño. But actually, it turns out that this is not the only other place in Chabad where this sefer is quoted. Turns out, I found the Ha'ara from Eli Matasov, from the Ha'aris of Tavoi Tavshem and Beis. And he says, and in Samach to Samach Tafresh and Zayin of the Rebbe Rashab, it says, Ubesefer Emes Liyaakov, Marechas Reish, Oiz Vav, Kosav, B'Shem, Moharanzal, Ta'ahuvim, Begamatria Doidim, and they are Zov and Nukva, and that Samach to Samach, Kefaloshin, Keneged Bezi Vugim of Avah and Zun. What is the Emes Liyaakov? Zokter Eli Matasov, it's the Emes Liyaakov of Rabbi Yaakov She'altiel Niño. And who's the Maharan? I looked it up. Maharan here is Rav Nosson Shapiro Yerushalmi Ashkenazi, who was also part of the Urchim Mefitza Torah Arizal. So Kumta is that actually the Rebbe Rashab already quoted from the Sefer Emes Liyaakov in Samach Tavish Nun Zayin, from the Guf HaSefer Emes Liyaakov. The Guf HaSefer Emes Liyaakov is Maroches Lefi Seder Aleph Beis, which is especially the type of sefer that Tzemach Tzedek, the Marash, the Rebbe Rashab like to use. And it seems like this sefer, which was printed B'chayat Tzemach Tzedek, was part of the Rebbe Rashab's library, and it was something that he used and was willing even to take material from it and introduce it into his Chassidus. And like I said, it's not a pella even for the Rebbe Rashab. It's just a chiddush to Taka find this one as well, even before the Rebbe used it more broadly. And by the way, once the Rebbe Rashab used it, so now there's also a Maimer Mug of the Rebbe, Samach to Samach Tavshem Aleph, which was printed in a Kuntrus and Tavshem Zayin, and right there at the beginning, on his base, the first page, it says Alpi, Mashakasa B'Sefer Emes Liyaakov, Huva B'Maimer Hanal, and it's this Taka very same Sefer Emes Liyaakov. One other place where the Rebbe mentions is in a letter from Tavshem Zayin, Igros Kodesh Chelik Beis, Igeres Reish Pei Zayin, about what darga is called Atika Kadisha, and the Rebbe writes, Sifrei Kabbalah, Ya'ayin b'sefer Emes Liyaakov manechas ha'ayin shetziyin le'itzchayim avish'arim, etc. So the Rebbe quoted it there as well, and that's in a more technical, strictly kabbalistic question of what exactly is Atika Kadisha. In conclusion, I'll mention that if you look through Kahas Sfarim, you'll see that the Chavri Marechas Eitzer Chasidim are mitzayin to Emes Liyaakov or Sfas Emes a few other times on their own in Chasidus Sfarim, Chabad Sfarim, and would probably be interesting to look at them all up, but we can't do all of that. I'll just point out one interesting one. At the end of Sefer Tzavos Harivash, in the Kahas edition, it's marked as Ois Kuf Mem Daled. It says, Misha ein le mikvah anos ve'eni yoch litbo mikvah yirchatz yadav v'yomer zeh kred merachitzu. You wash your hands instead, and you'll say the following: Ken kasav ha'arizal l'shem yichuk u'shebirich l'shchintei erchatz b'nikoyin kapai yiratzon that the rechitzas yadai should be ki'ilu tavalti. So in the Kahas edition, the Ha'aris of Rabbi Emanuel Shachat is mitzayin to Kunchus Vas Emes Nispach LaSefer Emes Liyaakov Izvav, and it's referring to the Hisafa at the end of the Sfas Emes. After the Samaches Oisius of Sfas Emes, he said he's also going to quote 10 Tikunei HaNefesh v'Tikunei HaGuf, and that he got from the Rashash, and that's Taka Oizvav of those Tikunim, and you Taka see that he brings this Inyan Mishem Arizal of Rechitza b'mokim Tvila. He writes there that it was already printed in Chemdas Yomim, Ayin Sham. So I was able to throw that in. I also, in conclusion, wanted to mention that MS, they printed a letter of the Rebbe, and we're excited they printed a letter of the Rebbe, but we ended up shtangzach on the part that was already printed. Like I said, even though it was printed, you can print it and still not know what you're printing and ignore it. So, of course, that was still kedai. If we had more time, maybe we would spend a little time takashtanzach on the part of the letter that was printed now, but we are really out of time. I just will mention that the Rebbe describes the plan in detail of all the Sfarim and Chassidus they wanted to print through Kahas in Shanghai, and most of them, I think like 7 out of 10, are Sfarim of the Mittel Rebbe, which reminded me as I was looking at it that really we should also take the time to speak about the Mittel Rebbe as the original pioneer of printing Chassidus. As we speak about the Frierdiker Rebbe and the Rebbe, or some have pointed out that Reb Chaim Lezer Buchovsky was the pioneer before the Frierdiker Rebbe, but really, argument can be made that the Mittel Rebbe is the very first pioneer and that he was 200 years ahead of his time in the scope and in the nature of what he printed, and it was come out not in a scalpel, you could say, by his dor, by the Tzemach Tzedek. And I was reminded of that when I was looking at this part of the letter. But ein kam mekoymai, and with that we conclude.